Roses are red, violets are blue. Don't let wild hairs wreck you. Valentine's Day is just around the corner, and our sponsors at Manscaped are here with the best tools to get you ready for the special occasion. This Valentine's Day, it's time to join the 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped, the leaders in below-the-waist grooming, with our exclusive offer. Go right now to manscaped.com, use promo code GWC for 20% off and free shipping. Once again, manscaped.com, promo code GWC for 20% off and free shipping. Today's episode includes mature subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Yes. Who is the great?
Uh-oh is right. You know, it's right in front of us. Would you...
Look at the expressions on their faces. It can only mean one thing.
Yeah, you two guys have a chance to run. Is he here?
I don't know. Knowing Piper, you just don't know. They know something. They're worried.
Bagpipes, snare drums, bass drums. 6 days before Starrcade. Kenny, you know, we got here earlier. He wasn't scheduled to be here.
But he is an unpredictable man.
I like the look of this. There he is.
Roddy Piper.
There's the rowdy one. There is Roddy Piper, live here on Nitro.
He's going to the ring.
Look at his eyes. Look at his eyes.
No fear at all.
We don't have to wait until Sunday.
Here we go.
We're going to have it right now on Nitro.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Many people are familiar with the Roddy Piper story. Born in small-town Saskatchewan, he parlayed a Golden Gloves boxing career into a match against professional wrestling legend Nick Bockwinkel. Though that match lasted mere seconds, he ended up pursuing a decades-long run with the WWF and then a film career. But what if I told you that the Roddy Piper story you thought you knew isn't true? And what if I told you that the true story of Rowdy Roddy Piper is stranger than fiction, more fascinating than fable, and one of the most exhilarating stories in Canadian history? Join us this month on Grappling With Canada as we take a deep dive into the mystery surrounding Rowdy Roddy Piper. Hello everyone, and
Welcome back
to another episode of Grappling With Canada. All the way from frosty Winnipeg, Manitoba, I am your host as usual, the Taxman. And to say that I'm looking forward to this episode would be a severe understatement, because this is the first 2-part episode that I've done of Grappling With Canada, because, to be perfectly honest, the subject matter today, there is no way that I could fit all of the information into one episode. I mean, I could have, and it'd probably be a 10-hour episode, but even I have limits. So we're going to break this up into 2 tremendous episodes, and I'm really, really looking forward to bringing all of you a fantastic look at the life and career of Rowdy Roddy Piper, starting with today's episode, episode 1. To say that there is going to be a ton of information, boy oh boy, that may be the understatement of the year. For those of you who think you know the Roddy Piper story, strap in. For those of you who, quote-unquote, know the Rowdy Roddy Piper story, even you are going to be in for quite the treat in this one. I have 3 incredible guests that I'm going to be bringing to you in tonight's episode. Part 2 is going to be something completely different, if you will. So I'm looking forward to bringing all of that to you in this episode and in part 2 next month. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, welcome to the program. You can go back into the back catalog, if you will, of Grappling with Canada on any major podcasting platform, whether that's GoodPod, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Amazon Podcasts. Wherever you buy, sell, trade, barter, or steal your favorite podcasts, you will find Grappling with Canada. While you're there, please leave a 5-star rating and a written review. If you leave a written review, I will be sure to read that on the next available program. Speaking of which, I have 2 tremendous reviews that I need to get to, which I'm going to later on in today's program. Also, you can find us on Twitter at 6_podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, youtube.com/c/six-sided podcast. We're also on Instagram under Grappling with Canada. And if you're on everybody's favorite Facebook, hold your applause, please. But if you're on Facebook, come on and like the Grappling with Canada Facebook page. And you can also come and join the Facebook group. Simply use that YouTube search bar and search for Canadian Professional Wrestling History. We've had a ton of tremendous photos and video clips that have been shared on there lately, and would be very much appreciated to come and have you share some Canadian professional wrestling history, not just specifically this podcast program, but anything related to the history of Canadian professional wrestling. You can find it there on the Facebook group. Also want to make mention of a few ways that you can support this program. In the Linktree link on the show notes of this program, wherever you are listening to it, you will find ways to support the program, some of which include the tip function on GoodPods. You can also directly donate to the program via the PayPal link. You can also pick up merchandise for the show, and thank you very much to, there's been actually quite a few of you who have been picking up the show merchandise lately. Specifically, I want to shout out Thomas Bryce from the SportsWire News Network. More on him a little bit later. But you can go ahead and search grapplingwithcanada.threadless.com for your Grappling with Canada merchandise needs. And of note, all the proceeds from the classic Grappling with Canada logo are being donated to charities. So pick up a shirt, support some charity, and support the podcast. Also, you can go on buymeacoffee.com/grapplingwithcanada. There you can also donate to the program. Everything donated essentially helps me provide a more in-depth, more research-driven program, because unfortunately, a lot of this costs or has an actual cost. So anything that you guys donate does end up helping the show. Speaking of helping the show, I want to give a quick shout out to the sponsors of today's program, Manscaped. Now, if you're like me and you're a little bit hesitant to try things directly from online sales, look no further. If you go onto youtube.com/c/six-sided podcast, or once again, check for the YouTube link in your show notes, you will find a video which will show you live and in living color some of the Manscaped products. And really, is manscaping not a good idea considering we're coming up on Valentine's Day? The holidays went by so quickly. Did you shore up your grooming routine with the best tools for the job? The Performance Package 4.0 from Manscaped is just the thing that every guy needs in their life to make each and every day just a little bit more special. The number one product in this package is the Lawnmower 4.0, which you can see all about my demonstration, review, and all the good stuff over on that YouTube video. This electric trimmer is designed to trim hair on loose skin, and get this, the trimmer's advanced skin-safe technology reduces nicks and cuts on your body, and it has a tremendous 4000K LED spotlight so you can shave in the dark. Oh, and by the way, it is waterproof as well, as we mentioned in the YouTube video. I'd like to propose making February 13th a national holiday as National Shave Your Body Day. If you're with me, hop on over to Manscaped.com, use promo code GWC, and if you get the Performance Package 4.0, Manscaped will even throw in 2 free gifts, the Shed Travel Bag and the Anti-Chafing Boxer Briefs, which you can also see in my demo on the YouTube program. And don't forget to smell good all over with their signature scent, the Manscaped Refined Cologne. That will complement your collection with smell perfection. Once again, go to manscaped.com, use promo code GWC for 20% off your entire order and free shipping. Once again, manscaped.com, insert that promo code GWC, and you will get 20% off your order and free shipping. Trust me, come this Valentine's Day, your lady will thank you. Also want to make mention of a couple of programs that I was very happy to be featured on lately. We're also going to be talking about that a little later on in the program. But the reason that we're all here today, the discussion of Rowdy Roddy Piper. Once again, as I kind of alliterated at the beginning of the program today, if you think you know the Roddy Piper story, think again. There is so much behind the man Roddy Piper that I feel has been either misreported intentionally, more on that a little bit later, or underreported, or has fallen victim to everybody's favorite revisionist history. So, what we're going to do today is kind of set the record a little bit straight on a few aspects of Roddy Piper's early life especially, but then some aspects of his wrestling and acting career as well. I want to make one thing perfectly clear before we get into today's episode. While we are going to be discussing some aspects of Roddy Piper's life, trust me when I say that none of what we're saying is in any way to disparage or to make light or to kind of walk back things that he has said about himself and his career in the past. We're not doing this program to kind of play the blame game. We're not doing this program to kind of make light of the way that he presented himself in the past. As I said at the start of the program, and I truly feel that Roddy Piper's story, the true story, is far more impressive than many of the stories that he has told about himself over the previous interviews and such like that. And it is certainly more fascinating than any of the, kind of sanitized or homogenized and pasteurized articles that you'll see written in things like the New York Times. There's one that they had written that's extremely egregiously wrong. Many of his obituaries, unfortunately, kind of parrot the mistakes that are laid out in other programs, which were not researched properly, or have just gone off of this wonderful revisionist history. I'm not trying to do the blame game, and my guests, I think you'll feel, are the same way. What we're trying to do is paint a picture of the man Roddy Piper. Not so much the wrestling side of him, but who really was Roddy Piper? Away from the cameras, away from the spotlight, away from the wrestling media narrative, we'll say. And I think that we're going to do a very good job today of really laying the groundwork of dispelling a lot of rumor and innuendo regarding Roddy Piper. Some of it he has put out there himself. Some of it has been exasperated by others who maybe are trying to protect his legacy. More on that a little bit later. Some of it is honestly out there from lazy and inaccurate reporting. So again, what we're going to do today is really spend some time to kind of unravel the story of Roddy Piper, remove some of the layers of material that really doesn't need to be part of the story, to let the much more impressive aspects of his story really shine through. And I think in order to do all of that, the three guests that I have on the program today, in my opinion, are excellent choices for three very specific reasons. More importantly, all three guests, without knowing it, tie into each other with what we talk about in each segment of the program. Today I'm joined by historian Craig Baird. He has a plethora of Canadian history podcasts. And what we discuss is a lot of the groundwork of what small town Canada is like. Because a lot of the start of Roddy Piper's story has to do with small towns. Especially here in Western Canada, where a lot of people just frankly don't realize what it was like back then and is still like today. So Craig Baird from Canadian History EHX and a multitude of other podcasts is joining me to really shed some light on the early life area that Roddy Piper came from. And it's really going to shed some light on later conversations that we're going to have in this program. Also joining me on the program today is Stanley Cup winner and Manitoba Sports Hall of Famer Cam Connor. Cam was essentially Roddy Piper's best friend from his time in Winnipeg onward. And Cam has some excellent insight into the mind of Roddy Piper. And you're going to see in his tale how this small town, Saskatchewan, small town Manitoba individual procured, we'll say, his gifts and parlayed them into the careers that we're going to discuss later on in this program. Also joining the program today is wrestling historian and author Vance Nevada. Honestly, Vance is, to say he's a treasure trove of information for Western Canadian wrestling does not do it justice. And in our conversation, there are going to be some very interesting and some very difficult things to hear about Roddy Piper. But more importantly, and like I said, more specifically, it's things that we're going to unravel to really get at the story, the actual story of Roddy Piper. The story that, in my opinion, is far, far, far more impressive than any of the A&E biographies, any of the quote-unquote mainstream media articles, the majority of the obituaries that were written. We're going to really get into who Roddy Piper was. And I think that you guys are going to be really, really impressed. Really shocked by some of it. I'm quite certain of that. But at the end of it, I think you're going to respect Roddy Piper even more than you ever thought you possibly could. Now, to get into all of that, we are going to play some classic Roddy Piper audio. And trust me when I say that we are going to go heavy on the classic audio in this episode, because as anybody knows, saying that Roddy Piper could talk his ass off is, oh boy. And that might be the understatement of the year. So we're into some classic Roddy Piper audio to get us right. And then we are going to start kicking it into high drive in today's program. Please enjoy.
I'm not that well acquainted with you. First of all, Andre, here we have this week on Piper's Pit, of course, Andre the Giant, supposedly the biggest man in the world ever. It's a pleasure to have you. Where are you from, Andre? I'm sorry, do you speak English? Andre, where do you come from?
It's none of your business.
If the questions are too hard for you, I will try to bring them down a little so you can understand. I understand big body, little tiny weeny brain. I can understand that. That's very simple. Let's get right down to facts. Is it not true that John Studd himself took the largest man like yourself supposedly in the world and picked him up and slammed him? Is it not true that John Studd slammed you?
Never.
Are you telling me that John Studd never slammed you? You trying to tell me at 540 pounds, whatever you are, that you cannot be slammed?
Are you understand English or not? I told you that one time.
At 520 pounds, if I'd given 5 minutes, I could slam you myself. I don't care. You're saying John Studd could at 520. Right now, you want to fight Andre? You're going to find out one thing. You do not throw rocks at a man who's got a machine gun.
Roderick George Toombs was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada on April 17th, 1954. Roddy's father worked for the Canadian National Railway as a police officer. Because of this career choice, their family had to move to many different outposts over the years. Some of these outposts include being stationed at the Pas, which was also, he was there for his first year of school. He was in Dauphin, Port Arthur, Dawson Creek, Winnipeg, Montreal, Toronto, plus spent some time abroad in Scotland and Australia. Now, Roddy and his father did not have the greatest relationship in the world. A little bit of this we're going to get into in a later conversation in this episode. But suffice it to say that in his early teens, Roddy essentially left home and actually ended up spending quite a bit of time living on the streets. Again, something that we're going to discuss later on in the program today. In 1972, he ended up meeting Tony Condello, somebody who's going to factor in big time in our conversations throughout this episode, but somebody who is not part of the Roddy Piper, we'll call mainstream story that's been presented throughout the years in many of the, we'll say, established medias and also in the A&E biography that you guys may have watched and been familiar with over the years. So he met Tony Condello, he being Roddy, met Tony Condello when he was 17, and he trained with Tony Condello till around 1975, after which is when Roddy Piper's wrestling career really takes off. Again, something that we're going to discuss later on in this episode in greater detail. Now, to get us into more depth about what it's like growing up in Western Canada, I'm very pleased to be joined on the program with Canadian historian Craig Baird. Now, Craig and I are going to discuss a lot of small town and rural Western Canada because if you don't live here, you don't really understand. And even those of us who live here, we kind of see it in a different light than many other Canadians do. So Craig brings up some very excellent points of where Roddy grew up from, where he moved to, including some great conversations about the Pas that we just talked about. Also, in regards to time that Roddy would have spent here in Winnipeg, up north in places such as Churchill, and then a little bit more about the landscape here in Western Canada, because a lot of the conversation that we have feeds a lot into the later story of Roddy Piper and gives a little bit more backstory into the man that Roddy ended up becoming throughout his years, obviously with his troubled childhood, but also more specifically being, stationed essentially out sometimes in no man's land. So we're going to get into my conversation with Craig Baird right away. Before that, I'm going to play some more classic Roddy Piper audio. Now, there's just a couple of things to note very quickly before I get into my conversation with Craig Baird. One is we discuss quite a bit about northern Manitoba, specifically some of the tours that Tony Condello ended up running, which would in later years be referred to as the Death Tours. In the story, and this is going to get a little confusing, so I wanted to kind of clear this up, and it'll get cleared up kind of further as we go in the program today. So, to alleviate a little bit of the confusion, in our conversation, we discuss Roddy's time in Churchill. Now, a lot of the narrative about Roddy Piper is that his first match was in Churchill in front of a bunch of lumberjacks, essentially. That was the story for a long time. Later on in this program, you're going to hear what the actual story is. However, I still think that plays such a fantastic part in the whole larger picture story of Roddy Piper. So we discuss his quote-unquote first match in Churchill. We discuss a lot of northern Manitoba. And we discuss a lot of the tours that ended up happening up there, conducted by Tony Condello. So, not to confuse anyone, a lot of this, as we move in the program today, will get straightened out the further we go. But if you're jumping into this, and you kind of know the true story of Roddy Piper, we'll say, and then you hear us talking about his first match being in Churchill, immediately your mind's going to go, wait a minute, that's not true. So, again, things will fall into place later on in the program as we progress today, but we're taking each segment one at a time, if you will. So I just wanted to clear any of that up before we move on with the program. So with all that being said, again, just wanted to clarify before we move into my conversation with Craig Baird. So we're going to get into that conversation on the other side of this.
And this man right here, you saw them going at each other, and you saw a lot of other guys in the ring. Here is Roddy Piper.
We get it real simple here. What we're talking about here is very simple. They try to ban me from all kinds of places. They try to do all kinds of things to me. And nothing has worked. They try to keep me off TV. They try to keep me off radios. They have Dick Slater coming up and kicking me in the face. Yeah. But that's okay. That's okay for Dick Slater to come down here and be on TV, and it's okay to bar me from TV because I come up and I slap him upside the head. Yeah, that's okay, right? Yeah. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Slater. Mr. Valentine, that's fine with me. If you want to get down and you want to do some fighting, I've had the wind knocked out of my sails plenty of times, man. I've had them down there on the dirt. I know what it's like to eat out of garbage cans, man. I know what it's like to sit there on the street and do nothing. I know what it's like to fight. They want me to sit down here and be calm and be just a nice little girl that walks around and does nothing. Yeah. Well, you're wrong, mister. So I'm telling you, simple and plain, give it your best shot or don't bother shooting at all, man.
Right, very pleased to be joined on the line by a man who has more podcasts than I have family members, Mr. Craig Baird. Craig, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic. And for anybody who thinks that that's a joke in the slightest, it is not. My God, you have more projects than I could even possibly fathom to have.
Yeah, it keeps me pretty crazy busy every day, all day.
So before we get into our conversation tonight regarding Roddy Piper, let's hear a little bit about yourself and what you're doing with obviously the flagship program, Canadian EHX, but what you're doing with the other programming that you have.
So I've got Canadian History X, which is, like you said, my flagship. It's the one that's got the 519 episodes as of today, I think. And it's kind of my catch-all, my small-town histories, my broader histories of Canada and all of that. And then off of that, I branched off into From John to Justin, which looks at Canada's political history, and then Pucks and Cups, which looks at Canada's early hockey history, like 1900s to 1930s, and then Coast to Coast, which looked at, because it's finished now, the building of the Transcontinental Railway, and Canada's Great War, which looks at the First World War in Canada.
I have to say, I thought I was a history buff. And boy, oh boy, I just get absolutely schooled basically 5 days a week, which is tremendous. And and you run what I love about it too is you run the gambit, right? It's not just, although I do love the small town aspect of it, because there's so many great stories across this country. Obviously, something that I've been discovering throughout my run with the podcast, but there's so many great stories across the city or across the country of these little small towns that you may never have heard of, but have big personality and big things to offer. So that's one thing that I really look forward to. But then you always get me the kick with the nostalgia episodes. I know that, and we had this conversation before that Mr. Dressup episode, man, I can't listen to that one and not get a little misty eyed.
I'm the same way. I mean, I had to spend, a few weeks watching episodes and listening to that theme song and then talking to Fred Penner and Judith Lawrence. And so it was just weeks of constantly getting hit with nostalgia. But, like you said, for me, I'm happy with it because it's my favorite episode. Not just because I think it's probably my most popular episode, but easily just, it was just so much fun to put together. And I love those nostalgia episodes just because I can just talk about things that I grew up with, whether it's, Red Green or Mr. Dressup or in a couple of weeks, SCTV.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, the Red Green one was tremendous as well. That's Steve Smith, right? That's his
That's him,
yeah. It's one of those shows where I remember being out at the cabin during the summer, and, you'd have a rainy day and there's two channels. You get CBC and then you got, I think we got it used to be CKND here in Winnipeg. And that was sketchy. But, and they would have throughout the summers run just full seasons nonstop of the Red Green show. So I had a lot of fun, listening to your program with him and just reliving some of the classic moments.
Oh, same with me, and being able to talk to him and everything was really cool. But kind of like with you, I think I was homesick, or it might have been in the summertime. And, CBC in the summer there's not much there, especially in the 90s. But then the show comes on, and I'm like, oh, this isn't too bad, And, I started watching it, and I trailed off as the 90s went on and everything. But it was something I always enjoyed, and still do now that I can watch it on YouTube.
So let's, speaking of nostalgia and all that, obviously all these topics kind of tie into our subject tonight. So just before we really get into, your expertise, if you will, and why I brought you on the program today, what would have been your first kind of memories or recollections of Rowdy Roddy Piper?
Well, I would have been watching him back in the the late 80s when he was at his peak with WWF or WWE. I mean, he was a heel, so I wasn't super into him. I was I was stereotypical. I liked Hulk Hogan. When Hulk Hogan got crushed by earthquake, I was writing out a thing to him, which obviously later I learned was just a way to get my information to send me stuff. But I mean, I don't know. I think that happened when I was 10, so I don't know. And I just thought, oh well, this will help Hulk Hogan. But yeah, I mean, I knew about him then. I knew because he had so much flair. He'd come in with the bagpipes. He's wearing the kilt and everything. And I had, at the time, I had no idea he was even Canadian. I think I probably assumed he was Scottish just by the way he dressed. Yes. And then I didn't see him for a long time, and then I was watching It's Always Sunny in Philly, and he comes on as the domain.
Yes.
That's Roddy Piper.
That's tremendous. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the, you didn't even know he was Canadian at first, and there was a lot of us in that generation where we just didn't know because kayfabe was king. And by God, if they tell you he's from Scotland, he's from Scotland.
Exactly. So I just assumed. I mean, why wouldn't I? His name's Roddy Piper.
Yeah. And the bagpipes and it's just tremendous. But with your research with the flagship program, is Roddy Piper a name that kind of came up in some of the previous episodes that you've done in regards to that program?
I believe he did in my episode on the pod because he spent some time living there when his dad was there. So I would have probably mentioned him as one of the people who kind of came from that area. But he spent a lot of his time in Saskatoon and Winnipeg, I think. So I haven't really covered the big cities. but I'm pretty sure that I did mention him in the paw. I think I did. I'm pretty sure.
Yes, and naturally that's one we're going to discuss in a second, but obviously he grew up in Saskatoon. Yes, so if you could talk a little bit about what kind of a city is Saskatoon, and then more broadly, like what kind of an area of ground does Saskatchewan cover in Canada?
Well, Saskatchewan and Alberta are very similar. You got two big cities, and in each one, obviously Alberta's cities are much, much bigger.
Yes.
But, you have your southern city of Regina, and you have your northern city of Saskatoon, and then you have the same thing with Edmonton and Calgary. Only thing different is the capitals are reversed. You have a northern capital and a southern capital. And, in those areas, you'll have a lot of little small towns that are, they don't have a lot in them because everybody goes to the city. These small towns have a few houses, maybe the local bar and some other things, but everybody goes into the city. I mean, I grew up outside of Edmonton in a small town called Stony Plain, and even in the 90s, there was nothing. Like, there was no theater, there was nothing to do. You just go into the city when you finally had a car, and that's where you do something. And so, especially out there with, there's so much space and there's so much open landscape. For someone like me who grew up on a farm, you just feel like you're this little island in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
And even though you can see the lights of the city, beaming off the clouds on a cloudy night, you still feel like you might as well be in, Timbuktu. It's you don't have a car or anything. There's nothing to do.
And obviously, with Saskatoon, it's still I don't think they have a population of 1 million nowadays. And it certainly was nowhere near that when Roddy would have been growing up.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. I mean, you can take the entire population of Saskatchewan and fit it in Calgary and still have room to spare.
Yes.
Because I think the whole province only reached 1 million, maybe 15 years ago. And so Saskatoon, just like Regina, have 250,000 people. And for some people, it might seem like that's huge because maybe you live in a town of 10,000 people. But, Edmonton has 900,000. Winnipeg has way more. I don't know the population of Winnipeg, but it's got way more than Saskatoon. It's probably got as much as Saskatoon and Regina combined. Never mind, when you start getting to southern Ontario, where you have just regular cities that people will call a town that have 100,000 people in them. So it's a very different atmosphere out there where, you say you're going to the city, and if you're within 150 kilometers of Saskatoon, everybody knows you're going to Saskatoon.
Yes.
Because that's the only city that anybody would go to in that circle around. And it same applies for Regina, Calgary, and Edmonton. Calgary a little less because it does have some larger communities around it with Medicine Hat and Lethbridge.
I guess it's interesting to go from, the small town feels of Saskatoon to move to Winnipeg, where we still, even today, view ourselves as a small town. We're not. I think we're about 800,000. Maybe it's a touch more by now, but even back, in the 60s and 70s, it was quite a bit more, like you were saying, than Saskatoon is, but still kind of that small town vibe, if you will. We still have it today. But I wonder what it would have been like culturally. Probably not much difference between Saskatoon and Winnipeg in that time frame, the 60s into the 70s.
I think that, for sure, they would have probably been pretty similar in terms of culture. I think a lot of people would have seen Winnipeg as a bigger community, and I think because we're Canadian, hockey has a lot to do with that.
Yes.
Because, the WHA comes along, Bobby Hull signs with the Jets, and Winnipeg has this major hockey team that's playing all over the place, whereas Regina and Saskatoon have never had that. They have their junior teams and WHL, and that's it. So I think in that term, that way, it's a very different culture. And even, your airports, even back then, probably flew to a lot of other places that Saskatoon's didn't. Regina stopped flying to international places when I was living in Regina in 2016. So you kind of get you get a feeling like it's a very backwoods type of place. It's a nice place. Like when I say backwoods, it makes it sound like I'm saying it's.
Oh yeah, it's not meant in a derogatory way. Yes, no, definitely not.
Yeah. But it's you drive to get from Edmonton to Saskatoon is like 6 hours, and you have towns along the way, but these are all places that are maybe 10,000. Like, if it's a big place, it'll be 10,000. I think the biggest place along the way is North Battleford, and I think they're 30,000. But the whole way, it's just, small little towns, and then suddenly you're in the big city. And then as soon as you drive out of Saskatoon, the next biggest place that you're going to hit is Winnipeg, and that's a long distance. So you feel very like everything is very small and isolated. Versus, say, Manitoba, where you do have Winnipeg, but you do have larger places like Brandon that are relatively, I wouldn't say relatively nearby, but they're close enough nearby. It takes 2 hours, 2.5 hours to go from Regina to Saskatoon. So it's this little dot of light amid essentially rural darkness up there.
And I guess I kind of, we always look at it, I might be speaking for myself as well here, but we always look at it here in Winnipeg as like, where it's the center of Canada, but we're kind of, we're away from everything else at the same time somehow. Whereas, you look at other parts of the country, like Ontario, for example, there's, vast distance between different cities, but they're much larger populations. So it doesn't necessarily feel like you're going, from, desolation to desolation as you do kind of here in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like Manitoba does have larger centers, and they're closer together. And I think maybe a lot of that is to do with the population is concentrated more in the south.
Oh, yes.
And you can kind of see how the population goes based on the Yellowhead. And, the Yellowhead goes through Edmonton, and then it starts going down, and then it goes to Saskatoon, and then it keeps going down, and then it eventually meets the Trans-Canada and Manitoba. But you can see the major population centers kind of following that. And so over half of Alberta is pretty well developed, and then the north, there's great distances between places. And then as you get to Saskatchewan, it's crunched a little bit more, and then when you get to Manitoba, it's crunched even more. So I think that plays a lot into it, where you feel like you have a lot more places that you can go to that are nearby, that are larger. And then once you start getting into eastern Canada, southern Ontario has cities everywhere and large communities.
Yes.
And places with 50,000 people that in Alberta and Saskatchewan would be a major city. I lived outside of Swift Current in Saskatchewan, and that's, I think, like the 10th largest city in Saskatchewan, or even higher, and it's only got like 12,000 people.
Yeah, it's funny you would, the 10th largest in Saskatchewan is probably not even in almost the top 100 in Ontario, right? Like
not even close, yeah.
But
yeah, exactly.
The point you just brought up with the Yellowhead kind of being the dividing line is a fascinating point, and I never did think about it, but it is. If you would look at a map of Manitoba, population-wise, yeah, it's, I think 3/4 of the population is in that southern area, because Brandon still falls right there as well. So there's your two biggest cities by far in Manitoba, and yeah, they're even we're separated from Brandon. I think it's 3 hours or a little bit less from Winnipeg.
Yeah, but it seems like it's, for some weird reason, it seems like it's almost closer than, say, driving from Saskatoon to Regina or Saskatoon to Prince Albert. Those are the three major cities in Saskatchewan, and together, combined, they have less of a population than Winnipeg does, by far. I think they probably together maybe have 600,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Must be the landscape.
Yeah. As you get farther north in Saskatchewan, it's all lakes. Like, there's tons of lakes up there with no roads to them or anything like that. Like, when they were starting to name lakes after soldiers who died in the wars, they just named all the lakes in northern Saskatchewan, because there's some lakes that are, a few hundred feet.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of them up there. So there's nobody really living up there. There's First Nations and things like that, and there are some smaller communities, but, it's few and far between for sure.
And it's not even like it is here in Manitoba, and this is where our conversation about the pause is going to come into play as well, because Manitoba, for as much as our population is quite southern, there's still quite a few developed communities up north. You have DePaul, which again we're going to get to in a second. There's Churchill, there's Flin Flon, Swan Lake, I believe as well is fairly developed. So and Thompson, I'm forgetting them as well. That's a fairly large, I'm using that in air quotations, but for a northern community it is. So I most people would be, kind of familiar with Winnipeg, but they would not be familiar with the Paw. And that's really, yes, and that's kind of really what I want to pick your brain about here. So when you were doing your research for your episode on the Paw, what kind of stood out to you as kind of like, like a wow moment or something that you wouldn't have pictured?
Probably the biggest thing, and it kind of relates to what you were saying, how, people don't really think too much about the community, and even though it is a larger community, I'm only, two provinces over in Alberta, and I thought it was pronounced the Pass. I assumed that my entire life, and I think in one of my early episodes, I talk about it, and I said the Pass, and then I wrote an episode about the Paw, and I'm like, you know what, I should just double check and make sure that I'm pronouncing this correctly, and I'm really glad I did, because it is not pronounced the Pass. But, I never thought of it. It seemed like PAS, so it's the Pass. But it seems like I kind of relate it back to hockey, because in many ways, wrestling and hockey, the types of people you get can be very similar. And with hockey, especially in the West and in Saskatchewan and into Manitoba, the people who grow up in rural areas, they don't have much to do. And so if you get into hockey, you tend to be kind of the players in the West are very different from players in the East.
Yes, they are.
They're rougher. You have Brian Trottier, and you have Bob Probert and people like that. But even there's Flin Flon, just north of the Paw, you got people like Bobby Clark.
Yes.
And so it just breeds this different type of person because of, I think, the isolation. And at times it can be tough living up there. I mean, it gets cold up there, and there's nothing really around you. It is beautiful landscape, but it's beautiful landscape in the summertime. In the wintertime, it's just, and I'm speaking from experience because I've lived in a few northern places, it's just desolate. And you feel like I go back to what I said before, you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, and you're just this little island, and the whole world is just this distant thing that, you can't even at times comprehend. And in some places, like you mentioned, like Churchill, you can't even drive there. You have to fly. Or take, at least in, I know when I was doing the research, or not research, but reading up on Roddy, and, his first match was in Churchill, and it was in front of a bunch of lumberjacks, apparently.
Yes.
And just, how long it would take to get up there, and you have to take a train, most likely, in those days, if you're not flying. And I just think that people don't even realize that about these small communities. They can be very tight-knit communities, and very, very prideful. Like, because they're isolated and they're small, everybody knows each other, and they have a lot of pride in being able to live up there. They're not living down in southern Ontario where you're just a few kilometers from a Tim Hortons no matter where you go, or whatever it might be. Up there, everything's local, everybody knows each other, and everybody kind of has that pride of being from a place like that.
Another fascinating part of his story, like you said, like his first set of matches were in Churchill, but even doing, as he got into his wrestling career and he's doing the northern tours, and, we can talk about distance between places, and, people in the States will kind of understand it. People in Europe won't, because that's just not the way that landscape is laid. But when we're talking distances between the Paw to Thompson or Thompson to Churchill, this is not, you're not, doing the quote unquote Crows line, right? Like this is if there are roads, they're largely impassable, especially in the dead of winter, like you were saying. In the summer, you're almost in the same position because we deal in, especially Manitoba, with a lot of ice roads in the wintertime, right? When summertime comes around, a lot of these communities now are just kind of cut off, except for flying in groceries or, workers or whatever. So there's almost no easy time to be doing tours like that, especially up north here in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. And you think about, you got these long drives through, for some reason, I just pictured the drives at night. So
Yes.
you have these long drives, and the landscape's dark, and you're not even really seeing anything. You can't be like, oh, that's a beautiful lake there, or anything like that. But then when you get to these towns, and in these small towns, you didn't have anything like I mentioned before. Most didn't even have a theater. If they did, they'd be getting movies well after everybody else. You didn't have much going on. You had the local bar where everybody would hang out, and you'd have the arena. And that was it. So it seemed like it would be, for a lot of people, a big event to have somebody coming and wrestling in a small community. Like, it would break up the monotony. I know for me, growing up in small towns, it'd be great, because when I had to go see WWF, I had to drive into Calgary or Edmonton
Yes.
with my parents. And, at times, right now I'm 25 minutes away, but there were times where I was a few hours away. And if I'm willing to do that, how great would it be if they came to my community? Obviously not the WWF, but, wrestlers come to the community, and suddenly it's breaking up this monotony. So I feel like the crowds would be very enthusiastic and do well. I would hope they would do well, just because what else you got going on? Unless there's like a big hockey game going on the same night, I can't imagine a lot of people aren't attending these things.
And that's the other thing too, right? Is you have to base it as well on the size of the community. So if you're going to a town, that town may only have, 600, 700, 800, maybe 1,000 people. And that's the town and surrounding areas. And you're out there performing in front of 500-600 people. You're literally, it's over half the town. It's crazy. You explain that to somebody who, Piper, he wrestled in front of, how many thousands of people in stadiums, and that's where he started. But you have to understand the context of what these towns have to offer. It's not, there's not thousands of people. There's 1,000 maybe.
Yeah. And like you said, half the town's attending it. I know I kind of compared, rural wrestlers to rural hockey players, but a better analogy would be, up-and-coming bands.
Yes.
Who are driving those long distances, and they're playing at the local bar, and maybe they've got a good crowd, maybe they don't. But then when you see them, say, selling out Madison Square Garden, you're like, wow, they're this huge band, but you kind of ignore those long years of those long drives and those small communities, and it's the same with Roddy Piper. You don't think about the fact that, when I read it, that he was in Churchill, I started racking my brain, well, how did he get there? Did they make enough money that it made it worthwhile to fly or to take the train all the way up to Churchill? Because, that is a long
It's a big trek.
Oh, yeah. And so I started thinking about that, and then you're in front of lumberjacks, and these guys have nothing up there. And, how rowdy would have that crowd been? All these lumberjacks who have been there for weeks or months on end. The type of atmosphere, that might have been some of the rowdiest crowds he ever had, and he would eventually be in front of thousands of people.
Yeah, it's a different kind of rowdy, because here we're using his name kind of in a punny way, but there are stories about him as basically inciting a riot down in Portland, and he's getting knifed at basically, but that's one type of rowdy. What you have in northern Manitoba, and a lot of this ties into the promoter who was running at the time was Tony Condello. And from my understanding, a lot of the tours were, it's not that they were, making a pile of money or whatever, but he really felt like, we have to go to these communities. We have to provide this type of entertainment, especially for the kids that are there, because like you said, there's limited sports, hockey probably in the winter, and who knows what else, not only in terms of the sport, but in terms of teams to play, in terms of equipment to get, right? It's harder than, and especially back then, way harder than it would be in today's day and age, most certainly. So he made it a point to do these tours, regardless of, if they're going to break the bank or not. That wasn't the point. The point was to service these communities who were appreciative and kept coming. And yeah, a lot of the crowds were, like you said, rowdy lumberjacks who were just wanting to see a good fight.
Yeah, exactly. And, you bring up the equipment. I don't know if they transport the equipment with them or not, but what kind of setup do they have in these small towns? Because it's not like wrestlers are coming through on a regular basis. So what do they have for the wrestlers to compete on? So you might be competing on sometimes not super safe, structures and things like that.
Yes.
Because these things are kind of, band-aided together because there's some wrestlers coming through and then they're going to be gone the next day. So you don't want to spend a bunch of money on, a whole bunch of high-priced equipment. And like you said, even getting it, now we could probably order a lot of it just through Amazon. But back then, I don't know, you order through the Eaton's catalog or something.
Yeah. and then maybe the train runs.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to wait for the train to get there. So, yeah, the logistics of it and everything. But I think for the wrestlers who did those circuits, obviously it helps play into them. I mean, I know with Roddy Piper, he had a very quick wit and stuff like that. Maybe that's something he honed being in these small towns and, having to be quick on his feet. And because, if the crowd hates you, well, this entire town essentially hates you now. And you have to leave this town. And some people don't realize that, it's, he's a very nice guy outside of the ring, but they might, the lines are blurred. So I think a lot of it plays or helps build the person that what, the athlete, wrestler, whatever it might be, it builds who they're going to be as they gain more success.
And the other interesting thing to think about as well, and I'm sure that this is the case in Roddy's instance as well, is, you're a lot more appreciative of your success later in life when you come from a situation like that, right? Where you have to make these, arduous treks for, very little, fanfare or very little money at the time. When you do make it big, like someone like Roddy, then you could always, even there's been countless interviews of him over the years of talking about, how much the fans how much he appreciates the fans because of, their appreciation of him and all that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of that is built foundationally in these, in the small town settings that he was in northern Manitoba.
Without a doubt, and I think he was somebody who realized that, you start out there and you're in those small towns and you rise up to literally the top of your profession, but that doesn't mean you stay there and you can fall back down. So you got to appreciate those fans. You got to appreciate the fans who got you to the top and the people who watch him in the WWF and say, wow, I saw him compete when he was coming through whatever, Flin Flon, 10 years ago. And, you still have those fans because you put on a good show. But I guess the other thing is you put on a great show, and then the next time around you come through, maybe you got more people coming out because they're like, oh yeah, I remember that guy. He did a great job. And they tell their friends, come on, he didn't come last time. Why don't you come see him this time? And it's like with a band. Suddenly that word of mouth, and it helps build you up a little bit more and a little bit more. It's those little baby steps towards eventually reaching the top.
I had a thought because you brought up the band thing. Now it's twice. So I was on tour with the band back in 2008, and we ran a tour from leaving Winnipeg. We went all the way out east. We went all the way to PEI and came back. And so I know firsthand what the experience is like when you go to a remote location and there might be 50 people there at the show or 100 people, right? But they're so appreciative. When you come back through, right, then it's you quantifiably see it right then. There's more people because they enjoyed themselves. You put on a show and, word of mouth, and they come out and support it. So I would assume that kind of word of mouth would spread more if the more you're out there, more you're in and around the community, and especially in, like we've been saying a bunch of times here, the underserved communities.
And I think by going through those and then you come back and there's more people and then you come back and there's more people, it builds your confidence and it maybe tells you that, okay, what I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing and I'm good at it. And you get that confidence that you might not get if, say, you grew up in whatever it might be, St. Louis or New York, where, there's always going to be crowds. but where you're sitting in these small towns in northern Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Alberta, and each time you go through, more and more people are there, you start thinking, okay, yeah, I can do this. And you start maybe thinking, I can take more risks and maybe put myself out there more, and it kind of gets you along the path of what you want to do.
So we're going to switch gears a little bit from the small town aspect to something that I've been pondering throughout the course of this podcast, and I really think it's prevalent to this conversation that we're having about Roddy Piper today, and that is a question of us as Canadians. We seem to have a hard time recognizing our success, our successful people, our successes in terms of, the international scene, etc. You go on down the list. And this is something where I found, with Roddy, yes, granted, his big push was in the WWF and he was from Scotland, quote unquote. So I can understand why some people would be, hesitant at the time to really claim him as one of us, right? But after he passed away, it seems like there was a bunch of a groundswell of support of recognizing him as a great Canadian. It's kind of gone quiet again. But from your perspective, what is it with Canadians that we have such a issue with celebrating our greatness?
I think it comes down to two words, and it's United States. We really want to separate ourselves, I think, subconsciously from the United States. We tend to align ourselves more with England, and we often see the United States as a place where it's, rah, rah, go us. And we maybe don't want to be like that. And I think that's the wrong way to do it. I think we should celebrate. I mean, that's literally the entire, other than I have a passion for history, the entire premise of what I do is look at all these things that, the good and the bad, accept the bad that we've done and learn from it. But look at the amazing things that we've done. And, my go-to example is, yes, the United States, you had Evil Knievel, and he was cool. But, we had Ken Carter, this guy who wanted to strap a rocket to a car in the 70s and jump over the St. Lawrence River. And Evil Knievel came out and said, this is crazy. You can't do this. And nobody knows who Ken Carter is. And I think that's just, we don't celebrate ourselves enough. And granted, he didn't do it. Another guy did it and got really, really hurt. Kenny Powers actually was the one who did it. And it's a good thing he did, but he eventually did die actually in an unfortunate accident. But we tend not to celebrate that. We do sometimes with really big celebrities, say like Keanu Reeves or Jim Carrey, where we go, yeah, he's Canadian. But then we also feel like it's weird to say, oh, well, don't you know he's a Canadian? Because that's what defines the person. And we don't want to be boosting ourselves up. And you see it in wars and things like that. Canadians, especially in the First World War, were some of the toughest, most bloodthirsty soldiers out there.
Yes.
But we don't really talk about it. We talk about Vimy Ridge and things like that, but we don't talk about how a lot of the Germans in some ways were very scared of Canadians fighting, and we just don't want to boost ourselves up. And I think it's just because we look at the United States and we want to separate ourselves from that. We like it when somebody from Canada does well, but we don't like it if somebody from Canada does well and then becomes an American, even a dual citizenship. And maybe that's why we like Ryan Reynolds so much, because he really pushes his fact that he's from Canada on a lot of the stuff that he does, and he supports a lot of Canadian things. So we're like, wow, we'd be very happy that he's Canadian. But then there's other people that we think of, and we think, well, why did you get rid of your Canadian citizenship?
Yes.
It's like, even though we didn't really boost that person up, or the person lives in the United States, maybe they like to vote in the elections, or their kids have grown up in the United States. A perfect example is Wayne Gretzky. He lives in the United States. He's the greatest hockey player in history, but it seems like he's not really pushing the fact that he's Canadian. And for some people, that rubs them the wrong way. And maybe with Roddy Piper, I think when he died, then a lot of people went to his Wikipedia page and were like, oh, wow, he was Canadian. I didn't have no idea.
Yes.
And I didn't for the longest time have any idea that he was Canadian. And then we see that, we go, oh, and he was really respected in what he did. And he was very well liked. And, he didn't have a lot of the problems that some wrestlers do have, and suddenly get prideful, thinking, "Wow, that guy was one of ours." We all know Bret Hart is a Canadian because even me growing up, I knew he was Canadian because my dad would get his autograph in a Calgary bar, so I knew he was Canadian. And the flag. I mean, but Roddy Piper, it was just a surprise. And like, oh, that's cool, and suddenly, it's after he dies, unfortunately, but then you kind of prop him up and go, yeah, he's one of ours. And I think, going back to your original question, it's just we don't want to be overbearing with promoting ourselves, and I think we need to do that a lot more, because there's a lot of cool things about Canada and its history and the people who've come from Canada that we need to celebrate way more.
Yeah, I have to agree. There has to be some type of happy medium between, to use the wrestling term, put ourselves over without, a lot of the grandstanding, if you will, I guess is the proper way to put it. It's just something that the more that I look into this, and obviously this program is very wrestling centric, but then the more I look at this program, the more I'm kind of seeing a lot of the other individuals from our history, and then obviously a program like yours, well, all of your programs, because even the from John to Justin series, right? There's so much about our prime ministers that I had no idea, and a lot of them were big deals, not just because they were prime ministers as well. And it's something that's not. We're very lacking. All Americans can name all 40 whatever presidents they have, but we just don't have that here, and hopefully it changes in the future.
I would hope so. I mean, going with what you said about the presidents, Americans would probably name at least 75% of their presidents, easy. And until I started doing the podcast and everything, I couldn't even name every prime minister. I could name quite a few, and the big ones, but
yes,
a lot of ones that I didn't know. And it wasn't until I started doing this, I'm like, oh, okay. And wow, these people did some horrible things, and they did some good things, and you learn more and more about it. And just going back to one thing you did say, I didn't know that John Tenta was a Canadian until I listened to your podcast.
Oh, wow.
And that's when I found out he was Canadian. I had no idea, but I knew who Earthquake was, and never even occurred to me he was Canadian. And then I listened to your show on him, and I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And that's another little thing that, we don't tend to seek out and find who is Canadian. Maybe we do a bit more with Wikipedia now, because you can just find out immediately. But especially back in the day, I assumed everybody but Bret Hart was Bret Hart and a couple of others, I think. I forget what Bret Hart's tag team was, but the other guy, I assumed he was Canadian too.
Well, Neidhart wasn't, but Owen was, naturally.
Yeah. But other than that, I just assumed everybody else was American, because it was so American-centric. So why wouldn't I assume that? And I think that actually applies to a lot of Canadian history, where it can be very American-centric, so we don't really think about Canadians involved. That really comes into play in the Second World War, where it's very American-centric, and Canadians kind of get lost in the shuffle there. And the same thing happens in wrestling and every other sport except for hockey.
Essentially, yeah.
I didn't know that player was, other than Rick Nash, I didn't know that player was Canadian. And then you find out and you go, oh, okay, that's kind of cool. And you boost your national pride just a little bit more, because somebody in a sport you like came from where you're from.
Yeah, I have to agree. Yeah, and further to your point, right? Hopefully there's maybe a grassroots motion, because Lord knows, God love the government, but they're not going to really do anything in terms of pushing our national, I don't want to say heroes, but you know what I'm saying, right? Our cultural icons. So I think it's kind of up to us to kind of get the word out there. And like I said, programs like yours, I think, do a fantastic job of that.
We really need to be more prideful of the things that our people have done. Because you go to the United States and, there will be a sign because some famous guy was there at some point for a little while. So you know what? Churchill put up a plaque and say, this is where Roddy Piper first wrestled. Because everybody will know who Roddy Piper is.
Mm-hmm.
And go, wow, I had no idea. And it's a little bit of history. Yeah, it's not a huge amount of history. It's not like he lived there or anything, but it's a little bit of local trivia. And it's something to learn.
So as we start to wrap up a little bit, would there be any Roddy Piper moments that really stood out to you in his career?
For me, because I watched him when I was pretty young, I don't remember a lot from his career. I remember his segments, because he had a lot of energy in those segments. But I actually mostly remember him, for the stuff afterwards, especially like the Maniac.
Yes.
That's kind of where I got rediscovered into Roddy Piper, and then he died like just after that. Actually,
yeah.
I found out that he was the Maniac. But I didn't really focus too much on him because I was a good little prairie boy, and I focused on the good guys. I liked Macho Man. I liked Macho Man and Hulk Hogan and the Big Boss Man. I don't think Jake the Snake was a good guy, but I liked him. And I can remember Roddy coming in, playing the bagpipes, and he was wearing the kilt and stuff like that. But maybe that's lends more to his thing. Like he was great. He had that signature and everything. But the people that I remember the most in my mind are, the Bushwhackers and was it Bruce the Barber Beefcake?
Oh, Brutus. Yeah, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Yeah.
For some reason, I remember those guys more than I remember Roddy. And maybe that's just because he was so good at his job, he made everybody else look so much better. And I ended up noticing them more.
And for yourself, what can we expect out of your plethora of podcasts in the near future?
Just the usual. I got a nostalgia episode coming up, and then just going to be plugging away. I'm going to be Pucks and Cups will end its second season in February, and then Canada's Great War will start up again for 10 weeks, and then they flip-flop. And from John to Justin, I'm finally finishing the opposition leaders who never became Prime Minister. And then next I'm going to be looking at the Governors General, and then after that I'm going to be looking at the premiers of every province. So I've got enough content there for years. I think I've got another 6 years of content that I can put out for that. So I'm just going to keep plugging away at it, bringing Canada's history, the good and the bad, and hoping people learn more about our history because it's awesome.
And how many more of the hour-long deep dives are you going to be going into on the program?
I'm trying to do more of those. Those are my Saturday episodes.
Yes.
My Wednesday episodes are always my small town history. And so Saturday I'm trying to do more longer deep dives, like with Emmett Fitzgerald. And,
yes.
Some of the other things I did were, and that also comes down to how much archival audio I can find. Because if I'm talking about something from 1850, I got nothing. I gotta go by like the newspapers and stuff like that. So I'm trying to kind of play that line where I'm in the era of CBC a little bit more, so that I can have those old interviews and things like that to kind of make more to it, and not so much of me just kind of reading a script and talking. So I love the longer episodes as well, because I feel like there's more to it. I'm not just putting a quick episode out, and I learn a lot more too.
Yeah, and don't feel like you have to go, 4 hours plus like I have to all the time.
Yeah, I don't think I could Dan Carlin. I can put at least 5-hour episodes out even if just every few months, because there's so much that I want to get out there. I just keep making podcasts and keep putting out content because I just keep discovering new things. And I'm like, oh, I want to talk about that, and then it's like I can talk about that in 3 months when I finally get a space open for that.
So naturally, your podcast can be found on every major platform that you can find this program on, except for you have quite the TikTok thing happening right now.
I do, yeah. I decided when January 1st came along, I was like, I'm going to start putting out TikTok videos. And so primarily it's on this day in Canadian history, and I just do a quick 1 minute, 1.5 minute rundown of some cool things that happened in Canadian history. But I'm trying to do some other things, like I'm starting What's in a Name, where I explain where names of communities come from, the big cities and everything, and then other little tidbits, because I'm trying to branch out more into a bit more video. I'm trying to do more YouTube videos because I want to go on location more and film it, historical places, and put a lot of that into it, because I really do enjoy the video part of it. Like I've told people before, the part I enjoy the least about podcasting is recording the podcast.
Yeah.
All of it. And I'm like, I love that part of it, writing it all out. And then I sit down and I'm like, oh, I got 6,000 words that I got to go through. And I know it's going to take me like an hour to do. And my throat's going to be sore by the end of it. And then I got to listen to it and edit it. And then I got to listen to it again. That part, it's part of the job. I can't do the job without it, but it's my least favorite part of the job.
Well, at least you have to edit as much. Well, I guess you actually would edit way more than me because of the amount of programming that you do. But yeah, it just I really appreciate everything that you're doing, bringing a lot of fascinating Canadian history to the forefront. And man, like hats off to you. You do such a fantastic job.
Yeah, and same to you. I mean, you put out fantastic episodes that are really good deep dives. You've got good mixtures of interviews and archival audio, and it's like I said, I learned things listening to it. Like Earthquake is Canadian. I didn't know that. Now I do. That's because of your show.
And before I let you go, where can everybody get in touch with you?
You can just email me at craig@canadaehx.com. I'm on Twitter at Craig Baird, CraigBaird, and Instagram and TikTok at Bairdo37. And then I've got, I think, about 700 articles all about Canadian history on my website, CanadaEHX.com. You can just go there and literally learn anything you want about Canadian history.
Coming up next is my conversation with Cam Connor. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, Cam Connor was a former professional hockey player. He was a Stanley Cup winner with the Montreal Canadiens. He was also inducted into the Manitoba Hockey Hall of Fame in October of 2015. Now, my conversation with Cam kind of joins a mid-conversation, if you will. Honestly, we talked for probably 15 or 20 minutes before what you're going to hear recorded on the program. Just all things Winnipeg. As was this case with my conversation last month in the George Gordienko episode with Marty Goldstein, when you get a couple of guys from Winnipeg talking, there's so much ground to cover. And it's funny that where I live now in Winnipeg didn't exist when he used to live here, although it is essentially a stone's throw from where he used to live growing up in Windsor Park here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So it's going to be an very interesting conversation. Cam tells a lot of tremendous stories about himself and Roddy. At times, some of the conversation is difficult to hear, and there is a lot of emotion in what Cam has to say about Roddy. So I really hope that everybody enjoys the conversation that I had with Cam Connor. Cam, it was an absolute pleasure talking to him in regards to Roddy Piper, so I'm real pleased to be bringing this conversation to you guys. But first, how about we do a little more Roddy Piper classic audio? So enjoy this promo, and on the other side, my tremendous conversation with Stanley Cup winner, Cam Connor.
The very controversial host of Piper's Pit, Rowdy Roddy Piper. Mr. Piper, I would stick around, but you're going to have to excuse me. I have to go to the men's room. I'll be right back. Thank you.
Oh, going home? Oh, my goodness, that's fine. Cow Palace. You can go to the men's room in the Cow Palace. That's a wonderful name in San Francisco because the Cow Palace is someplace that I would be proud to call my home. Cow Palace is someplace that I'd be proud to bring my gal. Because obviously if you live in San Francisco and you are going out with gals, obviously they belong in the Cow Palace. I saw one, the only thing she was missing was antlers. She would have been in season, Jack, man. I saw her coming up to me, asking me for a date. I says, man, I'm Hot Rod. Are you kidding me? He said, yeah, but aren't you the one that's going to fight Mr. Wonderful? I says, yeah, I'm going to fight Mr. Blunderful. He says, but aren't you the one that's going to fight him with all them wrestlers around the ring? I says, yeah, that's me. He says, don't you know what he's thinking? Of course. Yeah, I know what he's thinking. Absolutely nothing, man. When he's in a room alone, he is all alone. You see, you forget, I rode with him. I know what an idiot this guy is. I know his moves. Oh, yes, he's tough. I know he's tough. You think I ain't, man? I've been around. You know that. I've been there before. He's tough enough to go and bench press 500 pounds. Who really cares, man, huh? Your idea here of a wrestling match here, you got 12 wrestlers around the ring. You got dancing midgets and leathers. You got everything that you've ever wanted in a match. You know why I signed this? Incidentally, it didn't take me 2 months to sign this match. No. It didn't take me 2 months to make up my mind, brother. No. I said, you want me to fight somebody? I'll fight anybody. Who do you want? Just let me fight him. Orndorff says, well, I'm going to take my time. Going to take me about 2 months, and I'm going to go right now and go to the bathroom and think about it, and now I'm back. Right there. It's your idea of Orndorff's father. You see, that's going to happen after you fight me. Going to be nothing left of you except for old and bald and ugly. You ain't going to be no hot rod. You're just going to be somebody that can't keep his bladder empty.
Thank you very much, Roddy Piper. Back in the Bay Area at the Cow Palace Thursday night, October the 10th. Don't you dare.
Where do you want to start?
Well, essentially, we could start almost at the beginning, because I understand that you essentially were friends with Roddy, like, right from childhood, but I really want to get a good sense, and, like, there are so many stories about Roddy later on in life, but there's not very much about how he was like as like when he was growing up. So that's really what I would love to dig into with you.
Yeah, like I was friends with Rod. I was at his funeral, and I would say he was like 45 years
that you guys were friends.
Yeah, and like he would, when I lived in New York. On the New York-Connecticut border, it was about 3 minutes from the World called WWF at the time.
Yes.
Their headquarters, and Rod would come over all the time and spend the night, and we'd go out for some drinks, and he'd take me out with Andre the Giant and a bunch of the other wrestlers, and boy, that's quite an experience. But, with Rod, we were about, I'm going to say, 15, 16, 17, right in that area. I'm thinking about 16.
Yes.
Oh, man, probably 15. Anyways, he moved into Winnipeg, and it just so happens our lockers were right next to each other. And, Rod and I, we didn't talk. We just did our own thing. And I mentioned, you probably heard it, the reason I got to know Rod was because one day I got a knock on my back door. It was somebody, and they had Rod with them, and they just said, "Hey, Cam, you're a pretty tough guy, and this new guy Rod's pretty tough. Why don't you have a fight?" So I said, "Sure." So we went out to my garage, and the other guys would close the door, and they didn't get to watch it, and we just went at it. And I could tell right away that this guy knew what he was doing, because he was throwing punches at me, and I just said, if I'm going to beat him, I'm going to have to knock this guy out. So my hands were pretty fast, and I threw a left at him, and he got his head out of the way. And when you hit something, you don't just hit it and stop; you go through the object.
Yes.
So I threw that punch like hard and fast, and he just moved his head, and my arm kept going, and my tricep snapped like a rubber band.
Oh.
And so he got me with a couple good shots, and I had a 650 Triumph in my garage, and you could hit me, and I went backwards, and just like the movie, over my bike. And so, did you watch that Rod documentary, Piper?
The WWE one?
The A&E special.
Oh, yeah, the A&E. Yes, I did, yes.
So they I guess, they had asked me for some pictures, and so I said, I got some of Rod. He said, well, you too. So anyways, I sent him a picture of me sitting on my motorcycle. So they put that in the documentary, I guess, just to show I wasn't bullshitting.
Yeah.
On the motorcycle that I flipped over. So that was the starting point, and Rod and I, we just hung around. We were two guys that he had a goal of always being a wrestler, and for me, I just loved the game of hockey. I played football, I played soccer. I was next to a lifeguard. I think you got to get a bronze 3, and I was a bronze level 2. I did tennis, lacrosse. Rod he played football in Toronto, and I also played football. And then when he got to Winnipeg, he just got out of sports and he just was a wrestler. And I remember at 19 years old, I was playing junior in the Western Hockey League in Flin Flon.
Yes.
And I weighed 190 pounds. Like, I was pretty solid because I had a summer job every year working for a company. I don't know if it's in business anymore in Winnipeg, called Supercrete. And they were a concrete company. And so I was in pretty good shape. I didn't have any body fat, and I weighed 190 pounds. And Rod was in good shape, but he didn't do the sport that I did. And he weighed 181. And the difference between the two of us was our legs.
Yes.
And so I remember we used to go work out at the Y all the time downtown. And we were in the showers after a hard workout, and there was this guy in the showers across from us, fucking massive legs. And so Rod just walked over in the showers and, "Excuse me, sir, how do you get such big legs?" And the guy, he said, "Well, my name's Jim Heighton." And so he was, I believe, if I remember correctly, a fullback for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers.
Yeah.
And so, you know, with all the power stuff you got to do being a fullback and the hard workouts for football players. And so he kind of gave Rod some tips to get his legs bigger. And I always kind of laughed at that. Rod and I, at 17 or 18, we hitchhiked from Winnipeg to Toronto. And
jeez, what was that like, by the way? Just
on the side of the road. Not many people wanted to pick us up.
Yeah. Even then, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, we get to this place and we got to as far as Thunder Bay, I think. I'm going to say the first day, but maybe it was the second day. And Rod said, "You know what? I know a spot where there's a hostel, youth hostel. We could spend the night there." I said, "Okay, great." So whoever drove us dropped us off somewhere, and it was late at night, and it was cold. And we walked quite a bit, and we came to this building where the hostel was, but it wasn't there anymore.
Oh.
So Rod said, "Oh, man, let me just knock on this door." It was a building, right? A big building. So
Yeah.
he was banging on the door, and it's like 2 a.m, and some guy answered the door. Said, "What do you guys want?" He said, "Well, it used to be a hostel. I was just wondering, you know, if it's still a hostel." He goes, "No, it's not." And Rod explained that, you know, we just hitchhike here. We're looking for a place to stay. And this guy said, he was kind of a creepy guy. He said, "Okay, come in here." And it was just like a big bare warehouse. And he took us to the middle of it, and he said, "Sleep here on the floor." We said, "Okay." And so we went to sleep right away. And, you know, when there's somebody you're sleeping, but you got that sixth sense.
Yes.
When somebody's standing over top of you, you just kind of feel it.
Yeah.
And both of us woke up at the same time, and this guy was standing over top of us, and he said, "Leave right now, leave." We said, "Yeah, okay, yeah, well, yeah."
Yeah, we're out here.
So we wandered around Thunder Bay. We found this baseball diamond, had a little dugout, and the benches, you know, in the dugout were probably 10 inches across. We slept in the baseball dugout on these benches, froze our ass off, and kept falling off these narrow
Jeez.
benches. And then the way we worked it is, one of us would stand there with a thumb out for 4 hours, and then we'd switch off to the next 4, you know. So I was in a place called Wawa. And in the Reader's Digest back in the day, it said, if you're ever hitchhiking across Canada, like, don't get like dropped off in Wawa. It's the hardest spot in the world to get a ride from. So we're at Wawa.
Of
so
course.
I said, "Well, I'm going to sleep in the ditch. You're to go first." So I did my 4 hours, and then I was looking forward to laying in the ditch, going to sleep for a while. And Rod, he got up, and then he walks across the street to this gas station, and I was watching the guy, And he's talking to the guys pumping gas, and he talked to this one man. And then I see him wave at me, so I grab all his stuff when I run across the street, and I always remember the guy's name who gave us a ride. His name was Tom Luck, and he was heading to Montreal, but he drove through Toronto for us. And so he gave us the ride to Toronto, and we got dropped off downtown Toronto in Yonge Street. And I mean, I could go on and on, but we ended up getting conned out of all our money.
Jeez.
And there was, like Rod, he could talk a bird out of a tree. He really could. He was smooth. And so, I won't go into all the details, but we got conned, and this guy was in this establishment who sucked us in for all our money. And so when we got out of there, we said, we don't have a dime between the two of us. We just got to Toronto.
Yeah.
So Rod said, we're going to the police station. This guy conned us. So we went to the cops, which was only a couple blocks away, and we told them the story, what happened. And they said, oh, yeah, they do that all the time. Every week there's people in here that have got conned out of their money from this group, and there's nothing that we could do.
Oh, they just picked marks, eh?
About it. So we went back, and they closed at 8 o'clock, so we sat across the street. We said, we're going to get this guy when he leaves. So we walked across the street, and he comes out, but he's with two, man, they look like ex-Green Beret.
Yeah.
And we're only like 17, 18, right? And so Rod says, let's go talk to him. So we go, and Rod's smooth, and he's polite. Explains that, we've hitchhiked, we just got here, we don't have any money at all, and I'm more aggressive than Rod, and I just think, give us our good money, we're coming after you right now. I was a little more rude than Rod. He kept it smooth, and so the guy finally said, well, feel bad for you guys. So he said to Rod, I'll give you $20 back, and you get nothing.
Oh.
You ended up having to sleep in the YMCA. You gotta get up at 5:30 in the morning, and you gotta sweep and clean up, and then they give you some sandwiches for the day. So we did that. We would spend a lot of time at Falcon Lake. My parents, at the time, they had a trailer that they kept out there all summer. So Rod played the bagpipes, and he would play those bagpipes every night. And man, you could hear it all over the campsite, over the water. And when we were hitchhiking, also Rod learned how to play the mouth organ. And man, don't ever hitchhike with somebody learning how to play a mouth organ. That's torture. It was torture. So, anyway, so he did. It actually was not too bad by the time we got back to Winnipeg. And what else? So Windsor Park Collegiate, we went to the school, and so Rod, I don't know, he didn't finish his grade 12, although he might have picked it up, but I'm not sure about that. And he would always, Rod and I were in some of the same classes, and we were in American history class, and so when we would go in, say our class was at 2 o'clock on a certain day, the hour before, the class was empty. The teacher was always in the teacher's room. And so Rod figured it out. He would stick a toothpick into the lock and then break it off. So when the teacher came and was trying to get his key in there, he would push that broken toothpick in farther, and he wasn't able to get in the classroom. So he'd have to cancel class, and the janitors would have to take the locks apart and so on. And Rod did this in a few classes that we attended. And then one day the teachers were talking, and they were talking about the problem with these toothpicks in the lock. And then they said, well, it happened to me too. So they compared who was in their their classes. And so it worked out that it was myself and Rod and the smartest guy in school. So that's kind of what we did in Winnipeg. And then at about just off of Main Street. And it starts with an R.
Redwood?
Some little spot, and so it was his first fight. He didn't have any money. I didn't have any money. And he didn't have wrestling boots, so he used his boxing boots because he boxed in Toronto.
Yep.
And he said, well, how can we make an impression? And so again, we didn't have any money, so I come up with the idea. I said, you know what we should do? Let's go out and pick a whole bunch of dandelions. And he had this little basket, so as he was walking to the ring, he would reach into his basket and throw dandelions on people all the way up into the ring. And, just to kind of make an impression.
Yeah.
And, so I remember that fight, and then he'd fight in Brandon, and so we would travel to Brandon together, and then drive all the way from Brandon to Falcon Lake. And I remember once Rod driving, he fell asleep, and we went up the road.
Jesus.
And then what else?
And if you go off the road near Falcon, nobody's finding you for a while, because that's a big area.
Oh, I know. So, anyway, that's kind of what Rod and I did. And we used to go to socials, and I remember I fought 5 weekends in a row, and in these socials. And I remember I fought one guy. He was really a tough kid. I fought him the year before, get this, in a church.
It is Winnipeg, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it was in St. Vital. There's a church that looks like, and it's on St. Mary's. I think it's St. Mary's or St. Anne's. And it looks like it's kind of like an upside down boat.
Yes, I know which one. Yeah, it's close to the fire hall.
So right in there, it was a wedding reception, and I ended up getting in a fight. Anyway, so the next year, we were at another social. The same guy that I fought was causing problems, him and a friend, and Rod and I were walking to our car, and there was a fight going on in the parking lot, and there was one smaller guy on the bottom, and somebody beating him up. I don't like to see that, because I always think, that if that was my brother or my friend or somebody I know, I would, like somebody to break it up. So I went over and I said to the guy on the bottom, hey, you had enough? He goes, yes, I lost, I'm finished. I said, okay, the fight's over. And so the guy that I fought the year before, who I beat up pretty good, he didn't remember me. So he pushes me and he said, who do you think you are stopping this fight? And I said, this guy on the bottom doesn't want to fight anymore. And he said, I ought to kick the shit out of you. And when you're a street fighter, you learn that, you know what, if you think you're going to get a fight, just start swinging right
Yeah,
now.
you're ready to go.
Punching. So I was a street fighter. And so as he's talking to me, I said, I know I'm going to have to fight this guy. So I remember I drilled him in the mouth 3 times. And he was bleeding, but he just said, you're dead. And I said, oh, those are my best punches. And I didn't remember this guy either. And so then I kicked him right in the knackers, square. And, I was a hockey player, and my legs were strong. And he just stood there, and he said, you're dead. And I remember saying, Rod, sucker the guy, man. I'm not going to be able to take this guy. He took all my best shots. And, Rod, he let me fight my own fights, and as it worked out, I did okay. But, so that was kind of Rod and I, never looking for trouble, but,
But ready to engage if it ever came across.
Well, we did what we had to do, and luckily, Rod, he used to, how old are you?
I'm 36.
Okay, so there was right on the corner of Windsor Park, and I don't know how familiar you are. I think it's called Canada or something, and it's on the corner of Paterny and Spears.
Yeah, they're Canadians. Yeah, there's a hotel and there's a couple of bars there.
Yeah, that's right. So back in the day when Rod and I were there, it was called the Windsorian.
Yep.
In And the Los Bravos biker gang used to hang in there, and Rod was the bouncer. And in all the years that Rod was the bouncing, he never had one fight in there as a bouncer because he didn't care to use muscle and try to fight you and show how dominant he was. He would just say, hey, buddy, come on, it's all over. And he'd just talk and calm things down. And he was a great bouncer because he never tried to show how tough he was. So he was a bouncer there. But one night, Rod and I were in there, and he said, we got to have a drink contest between a wrestler and a hockey player. Well, so we'd ordered double vodka grapefruits. And so I would drink mine, and when I turned my head, he'd throw his over his shoulder.
Oh,
so in half hour, I drank 6 doubles, and Rod didn't have any.
Yeah.
So I wasn't feeling good.
Yeah.
And I only lived 1 minute away from there, so I just said, okay, I'm out of here. Rod stayed. And there was 2 guys from another part of town, and there was this skinny basketball player who was engaged and went to our school, Windsor Park, and he came up to Rod and he said, Rod, I might need some backing. I said, these 2 guys over there, they're telling me I got to let my fiance dance with them or they're going to cause some troubles with it. And Rod, well, they shouldn't do that. So Rod went over politely and said, you shouldn't be doing that. And this is his fiance. Just give the guy a break. And then Rod sat down again. A little while later, the guy come up and tapped him on the shoulder. So Rod turned his head, and Rod's sitting down. And the guy just drilled Rod and knocked him to the floor, then jumped on him. Well, Rod, he was a tough cookie. In wrestling, you want to wrestle? Okay.
Yeah, here we
go.
go.
Him down, and he beat the guy up in there, and then they kicked everybody outside, and then the guy would say, let's go again. So he fought Rod again. And, I know Rod. He beat him up pretty good, and then the guy broke his watch, and so Rod went some money out of the guy's pocket to fix his watch. And, so he was a tough guy, but he never walked around and played the tough guy role ever.
It's interesting to hear you talk about how he would, kind of just smooth talk his way through things, because that honestly became one of his biggest trademarks through, his whole wrestling career was just his verbal skills and how he could just, he could talk anything. He'd talk anyone into a room or out of a room or into a fight or out of a fight. But it's so neat to hear that this was happening, at, 16, 17, 18 years old.
He always had that gift. Like, it was a gift. There wasn't many people that didn't like him, and he treated everybody well. I mean, the nerdy guys in the school, I was never rude to them, but I just walked by him, and Rod would always go to his way and talk to him, and he kind of taught me an awful lot about how to treat people better than I did. And so Rod was a really good role model for me. And another thing that I remember about Rod, and I haven't told many guys this one, so that same Windsorian, as it was called back then. So Rod used to have a white Vega. That was his car. It was, it was a new one, but it wasn't, Vegas aren't good cars.
Yeah.
And so he had a pit bull. And this pit bull, he would, first of all, he always told me this dog, when he was on the road, he was at a motel and he ate this. The guy who owned the motel, he killed his German Shepherd. Oh, man.
Jesus.
Yeah, he just hates other dogs. And I remember Rod pulled up in front of my house, and he had his back window open, and I had a little black Cocker Spaniel. And so this pit bull jumped into my parents' yard where I lived, and my black Cocker Spaniel, being territorial, went after the pit bull.
Oh.
And I'm going, oh, no.
Here we go.
We'll turn around and jump back in the car. So I started laughing. But so what Rod would do, so when he would go on the road, like I said, he'd fight it, they would travel together. And he would leave his Vega facing, there's a field that used to be behind. I don't know if it's developed right now, but it was a big field back there. And they had like kind of a swampy area. And so he would roll his passenger window down, and he would put food on the bottom of the floor, like a big bag of food, just empty it.
Yeah.
And
like in the passenger seat of the car?
His dog there when he would go on the road. And that dog, just about every time, except the very last time, the dog was gone. We couldn't find him again. But he did this like 15 times. That dog would just stay there, jump in and out, and he'd always be there when Rod got back.
Yeah.
I remember that.
So when you had started your like junior career, and obviously he's on the road wrestling, were you still able to keep in touch with him at that point as well?
Well, he'd come up to Flin Flon when I was playing in Flin Flon.
Yes.
And sometimes we'd be in different cities, whether we got a Swift Court, and if Rod was in town, we'd hook up. But, you know, we stayed in touch, and it was only... And then after I went to Phoenix out of Flin Flon, and Rod would come to Phoenix and we'd hook up. And there was probably a period of time where, again, they didn't have cell phones. And we lost track of each other for about 4 years, 5, 6 years. We lost track. And I got sent to the Rangers farm team in New Haven, Connecticut. And there was this poster up, the wrestlers are coming to New Haven. And one was, it said Roddy Piper. And so we were on the road that night, and I didn't think our team would get back in time for me to connect with Piper. So there was a guy in charge of security for the arena. And I said, listen, Piper's a good buddy of mine. Could you give him my phone number, please? And just let him know. And so he said, sure. So, anyways, as it was, Rod, when he got my number, he had announced over the PA system called the New Haven Coliseum. He was hoping I was there. And he said, Camp Connor, please meet so-and-so at such a place. And within the arena, but I wasn't there. And so the security guy, Rod, wanted to see my dressing room. So he let Rod in the dressing room. And so Rod, he took one of my hockey sticks, and he had all the wrestlers that night autograph it on my hockey stick.
Oh, no way.
So he left that installed for me with his phone number. So when I got back, we connected again, and he brought his girlfriend. Maybe he got married. Maybe he got married. I don't know. Kitty, his wife.
Yes.
And he brought her out to New York, and so we got to know her a bit, and so we never lost track from that point on.
Wow, just what a crazy set of events, hey, that you would wind up in the same city as him, just randomly and see a wrestling poster. Hey, that's so wild.
And you know what Rod did too one time? So New York City, they have there's 2 or 3 main television stations that everybody watches, and so Rod, he was saying to me, I told Rod my career is coming to an end, and I really wanted to be a coach. And New Haven, Connecticut was only 1 league below the NHL with the American Hockey League.
Yes.
And I said, I got a chance to maybe coach that team. I said, they let me coach the last 5 games of the year because I was hurt, and we got in. I won all 5 games, and we did pretty good. And so I told Rod, I'm going to try to get a hold of the right people to see if I could have a chance for an interview to try to coach a team. And Rod said to me, well, I'm getting interviewed on the top station in New York City. Watch tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Really? I had no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
So they're asking him about the upcoming matches in Madison Square Garden. And Rod's tilting on his chair. And right in the middle of the interview, he goes, if they made Camp Connor the coach of the New Haven Nighthawks. He'd be the best coach. You should get that job. The guy interviewed me. He said, what? Because this was live, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good friend.
That's unbelievable. And you know what? I can completely picture in my mind him doing something like that. Like Roddy with a live mic and just...
Oh, yeah. He was, like I said, to other people, he was somebody that was really, really good for me in my life, and I credit him for giving me a lot of confidence. I came from a pretty aggressive household, and I didn't have the confidence, and Rod saw the potential in me, and he'd always pat me on the back and make me feel pretty good about myself, and I gotta give him credit for me making it pro hockey. I really do.
So when your pro career came to an end, and then you were, because I know that you had gotten into assistant coaching after that as well, and that's kind of at the point where he was really on the big upswing with the WWF.
Yeah, that's right.
So where was he still, or I'm assuming that you both were in pretty good contact at that time as well.
We were.
How was it for you seeing, obviously I'm sure he kept tabs on you throughout your NHL career, and I guarantee you he knew all about that double overtime playoff winner, for example. But I wonder how it was for you seeing him on that big stage, and then I wonder what he thought about your playing career and seeing all the great moments that you had in your NHL career.
Well, you know what? I really believe that looking back, it's kind of interesting that Rod and I never talked about wrestling too much, and we never really talked about hockey too much.
Really?
I told him, as you probably know, I got drafted number 5 in the NHL draft.
Yep.
But I didn't have, I told you, I didn't have that confidence. I said, well, somebody must have made a mistake. And, when you get to that top level, you got to have confidence, man. You got to have that confidence. And so when I look back at my career, I had all the potential, but I didn't do nearly as well as I could have. I had the tools, but I never believed in myself. And so that's the only thing I would ever say about my hockey career is that, I should have done better. I had the tools. I never did. And Rod, he was a little man in a big man sport.
Yes.
But yet he rose to the occasion, and I was so proud of him. And I know the only thing he used to say to me, how come you call me Roddy Piper? He said, why don't you call me by my name? We're not wrestling. Why don't you call me by? And I never thought of it. I said, wow. He said, I just said, I don't know why I call you Roddy Piper, but if you want Rod Tubes, I don't have a problem with Rod Tubes. So I stopped calling him Roddy Piper. But yeah, we didn't really talk too much about what we did. I remember we gave him a tape back in the day when the
VHS, yes.
And it was all Rod in different highlights that I don't know, my wife or my son. Rod should have this, so I gave it to Rod, and he didn't get most that. Threw it in the trunk. He didn't care. It was a job, and and it was the same idea with Rod and I. People used to ask me, say, well, did you watch hockey all the time? And when these games came on, and I had said no, I never did, because I said, does the mailman go for a walk on his day off?
Yeah.
And it was kind of like that.
Kind of the same concept.
And it was the same with Rod. When the time for wrestling, then you focused and you did your homework. But, we spent very little time. If I asked questions about it, we would talk about it. But we had enough in common, and we went back a long ways that we didn't have to be superficial just to keep the conversation going, right?
Yes.
So,
And then how was it for you guys in your relationship after, because obviously his wrestling career spanned, 10 or 15 years after your hockey career had ended. How was it after he was done, wrestling full time, if you will? I know that's a poor choice of words because nobody's ever really done in wrestling, but how is it for your guys' relationship after he got out of wrestling? Did it, was it easier to connect then?
Because he was always doing autograph sessions, and he was doing, I think it's called
Comic-Cons?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, like, for example, he was in Toronto, and he said, "Can you come out and help me?" So he flew me out to Toronto. He was there for 3 days signing autographs. There was a science fiction one.
Okay.
And so they had Leonard Nimoy and...
oh, that must have been the what do they call it? Central Canada, I think. That's the big one in Toronto.
Yeah. And so he was in there, and I don't remember their names. Princess Leia.
Oh, yeah, I'm drawing a blank, yeah.
That little midget, he's like 2'8".
Vern Troyer.
He was there. Like Alice Cooper. Like, there was a lot of celebrities. And other than the two, Captain Kirk and Leonard Nimoy, that's Spock, is it?
Yeah, well, yeah, Spock was Nimoy and then Shatner was Kirk, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so those two, they had the longest lines for autograph. Rod was the next. Everybody else
wow.
blew him away. So the first day, we probably, but Rod signed, and they had pictures with him. And so we did that for 3 days. And then he said, "Well, come on to New York with me." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, they've offered me so much money, my career's over, but I've been offered some big dollars to fight in Madison Square Garden." I said, "Rod, you got tooth and hip replacement." He said, "I got to do it." He said, so anyway, I went to New York with him, and it was in Madison Square, and John Cena come after me one night. He was going to beat me up. Anyways, that's another story.
Well, let's hear that one. I got to hear that one now.
So Rod needed to get me a pass. So they were really hard to get. And so Rod said, "Well, he played with the Rangers. He knows that." "Okay, we'll give him a pass." So I put the pass on my thigh, on my pants. And so I got to go down, just where the hockey players would go into the dressing room. I stood outside, not in the hallway, but just out of the way by myself, and I didn't have a seat. And so the wrestlers all changed in the same dressing room.
Yep.
And so Cena was up next, and you could tell, with that kind of a pump on, he's done steroids. And I think that's affected the guy, because when I see him on TV now, he's got the big smile, nice guy. But so I'm standing way off to the side, and I see him pacing up and down, not before he was going out. And so then he spots me, then he puts his head down, and he walks over and he bumps into me. He says, "What the f*** are you doing in my way?" He said, "I ought to kick the shit out of you." I said, "I'm a friend of Rod's." I said, "I'm just waiting for him. Get out of here." He said, "When I finish this match, if you're still here, I'm going to kick the shit out of you."
Jesus.
And so, you know what? I mean, I was like 55 years old. And, if I was that teenager again, I might have been stupid. Right? But I just knew I couldn't have a chance against him. And so he was out, and I didn't see him come back. He wasn't back yet. Then Rod came out of the dressing room, and he said, "Well, come on in the dressing room." I said, "Is Cena going to be in there?" He said, "Yeah, he'll be in there." I said, "Is he in there now?" He goes, "No." I said, "Well, you're going to kick the shit out of him." He says, "You'll be okay. Come on in the dressing room." I said, "All right." So I go in the dressing room, and I'm sitting next to this great big black wrestler. He's like 550 pounds. Big guy.
Oh, would that have been Mabel, maybe?
I don't remember. And so I'm sitting next to him, nice man. He's talking to me, and I said, "Hey, did John Cena come in?" He said, "Why?" And I kind of told him the story. And he said, "If he sees me again, he's going to come after me." He said, "You just stick near me." He said, "I'll protect you." I said, "You will?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." So I remember John wasn't back yet, and this big fella had to go take a piss, I almost went with him. Maybe I better go with you, So, anyways, as it worked out, seen her come in the dressing room and he looked at me, right? But he didn't do anything. So, anyway, but he got my attention, I can tell you that.
Yeah, maybe he calmed down a little bit whenever he was on there.
Well, maybe he didn't see this pass. He just thought I was a fan who shouldn't be back there.
Oh, yeah, that's true too, yeah.
So, and then after, I remember Rod and I, we took a limo. We went back to the hotel right across from LaGuardia Airport. And his buddy Ric Flair was there. So, Rod and I and Ric Flair, we went down and had some beers together. Really nice man. I really enjoyed that. And, I still got all those pictures of Rod and at what do you call it?
Comic-Con, yeah.
Comic-Con. I got a bunch of pictures from then and then like with Rod and I and Flair, and so I just actually came across those the other day. Nice seeing them. So anyways, yeah, so Rod and I, we stayed in touch during and after. And then in fact, he was writing his book and he phoned me up and he said, hey, can I come to Edmonton and I'm bringing my ghostwriter, my writer, because I can't remember any of our stories growing up. And could you maybe tell some of the stories? I said, sure.
Wow.
So he was here for 3 days. And so I'd hook up with him and his writer, and then he went to Calgary after that to see Bret Hart, but he didn't let Bret know he was coming. And Bret was flying off somewhere, so he went back to Portland, and Rod phoned me a few days later, and he said, you know what? I think it was Wednesday. He said, let's talk again on Friday, and then he died Thursday night.
Jeez.
So, like I said, I went to his funeral in Portland, and it was kind of interesting because the WWE at the time, they were in Portland, so Rod lived outside, I think it's called Hillsborough. And so there was a number of the wrestlers that came to his funeral. And I've never seen such big men in suits. Like I was standing behind some guy. His shoulders must have been like 5 feet across. It was huge. And then where was that girl's name? China. She was there. And so anyways, so I went to his funeral, and I met Rod in Vegas. We were in Vegas, and I looked out my room, and Planet Hollywood, and his name's going around the sign, and I phoned him up. I said, where are you? He goes, oh, I'm in Vegas now. And I said, guess where I am? He said, where? I said, I'm going to cross the road. I'm across the Planet Bellagio. Anyway, so we hooked up for 2 or 3 days in Vegas. And, so yeah, we met all the time in different spots. And then he would come to see me in Edmonton, and then in Winnipeg. When he got the key to the city, he asked me to join him. So, I was, part of that with him. So yeah, so we have quite a history.
But I guess he would have missed then at that point your induction in the Manitoba Sports Hall of Fame then, right?
Well, when I went up to make my speech, as I said just, and I think it was, Rod died at the end of July 2015. So I think it was just a month or two after is when this induction.
Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was September is when they did that.
Yeah, it sounds right, August, September, yeah. And as I said, I had a good friend of mine, Rod Toombs, a.k.a. Rowdy Roddy Piper, who was going to join me today for this honor. I said, but unfortunately, he just died a couple months ago. Because he was planning on coming, so, we bought the table. So that would have been nice.
Yeah, I'm sure that he would have been, as thrilled as you were to be in, because I know that it's a big honor, first off, to just get inducted, but I'm sure it would have meant a lot, considering how you guys, grew up together, and somehow, through the luck of whatever higher power you want to say, just keep running into each other. And even, like you just said, that story about you're in Vegas and you see his name on a marquee, like, it's fate that you guys were just connected by fate. It's crazy.
And, the one thing that was really good that, like when Rod and I were just teenagers, he had nothing money-wise. I had nothing money-wise. We were just friends. And we used to, like I said, street fight and do a bunch of shit together just as friends. And, quite often when you get to be famous, all of a sudden people want to party you. And Rod never really knew who his friends were. Did he like me because I'm Roddy Piper? And he always said, you know what? You're my friend, and I know that. And that was comforting to him.
Yes.
Because, like he's like when he got, wow, I won't go into that. But it was comforting to him. So he always knew that I was his buddy not because he was Roddy Piper.
And that's one of the downsides about, the professional wrestling industry back then, for sure, but I don't know that it's changed very much now, is, it's a lot of paranoia, both, self-inflicted and put upon you by others. And you just, like you said, you really don't know who your friends are. And there's so many instances throughout history of, the backstabbing and the politics and all the Zabada. And I can, visualize in my mind how something like that would affect someone like Roddy, who, again, like we've been talking about, is such just an easygoing, like smooth individual. And just, if you just don't know. So I could for sure see how he would find comfort in an actual connection with yourself.
Yeah, and it's no different than, I'll use hockey as an example. I know, even when I played, we made better money than the average guy did. And the guys today make really crazy numbers. And you just never know when let's say you're single and you meet a girl, do they really like me because I'm such a good guy? They fell in love with me? Or because I can offer them a good lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like what athletes have to think about. Right? Have to think about that. And so Rod, he had his share of people using him and trying to use him. And he'd rather be by himself. And I don't blame him.
Yeah, because there's so many horror stories in, especially wrestling, of guys who just, they get bled dry by all these grifters who just hang on and hang on and hang on until there's nothing left, and then they're gone. You never see them again, and it's such a shame.
Rod told me one time, like he said, the promoters are very dishonest.
Yes, that's one thing that I've come to realize during the course of this program.
And so what he told me, he said, do you ever see Cam when I go into the ring, and not only me, the other wrestlers, because they got to have showmanship, right?
Yes.
So he says he gets in before the match, and he'll walk to one, because there's obviously four sides of a ring. He'd walk to one side and look up into the stand, and then he'd go to the other three sides, and he'd look in, and he said, why I'm doing that? I said, yeah, you're giving the fans dirty looks. He goes, no. He said, we're counting the number of empty seats, because the promoter, we get paid a portion of the
gate.
The gate, and if he said, it was hardly anybody there, he said, we've already looked ourselves.
Yeah, we counted.
So that's why they go to all four sides, is to look at the fans.
Yeah, and I've heard many stories of guys doing that, in the 80s for sure, in the 90s, just because they didn't know. And at that point, they were paid so heavily by the gates where you're you're messing with their money when you're doing that.
Yeah. So, Rod had a great career, and I think, a big part of his success, as you said, was that he could talk and he could think on his feet. And his interviews and the Piper pits and in the ring talking in the mic, that was all, it just the stuff that would come right from inside of him. He was a natural at it, and he never ceased to amaze me. Like, never did.
It's funny you mentioned the Piper's Pit. So I think he started that in the mid 80s, and we're in 2022, and they're still trying to do the same thing. Like, that's how influential it was, and that's how much of an impact. Obviously his entire career is extremely impressive, but when you start boiling down certain parts of his story, like just that one alone, they're still trying to, retcon that one and figure out why it was so successful and how it worked. But really, it boils down to it was successful because it was Roddy.
100%. Oh yeah, Rod. Like I said, he was good with me over the years. Like when I worked in New York City after my career was over, he would come into New York City and he almost got me fired a couple times from work. Holy, like seriously, we would stay out too late, and I got to go to work, and he'd still be in bed, and I don't even know if I want to tell you some of those stories, but he was. Remember one day he phoned me up, and he was landing in New Jersey, and he said, "I'm coming into New York City," and he said, "Book me a limo." I said, "Okay." So I phoned up a limo, and I said, "Pick up Roddy Piper at such and such a time." He goes, "Okay." He said, "But he's not going to wreck my limo, is he?" I said, "No, he's not going to wreck your limo." And I remember Rod and I in New York City, I said, "Well, we'll try this club." And so it was hard to get in a lot of the popular clubs. So we would never try to walk to the front of the line and say, "Do you know who we are?" We never did anything like that. We'd stand in line.
Yeah.
We'd stay just for a little while. And I remember the bouncers would walk down the line. And if you're a pretty girl, he'd say, "Oh, yeah, you can go in."
Yeah, lift the deal.
When Rod and I were standing in line, and then they get Rod, they go, "Roddy Piper, oh, yeah, you guys go right in. Go right to the front."
Wow.
So then we went in this private club. There was a private club within the private club. so they said, no, you guys go in that private club.
Yeah, I go in the other one.
All free booze all night long. And,
yeah.
Like I said, I had to work the next day, which I probably should have phoned in sick, but Rod, bad influence.
No, you're a good Winnipegger. You never phone in sick when you're hungover. You just get in there and pound some coffee and get through your day.
Well, I did, but it was pretty hard. Anyways, I've talked to your op, so we should let you go. But anyways, I don't know if I've answered your questions or.
No, this has been tremendous. Like I said, you read, or you can read, depending on the source. Some of them are better than others, but you can read, articles and whatever about, Roddy wrestled here, he did this, he did that, but nobody has ever taken the time, I feel, to really, look at who he was, not just outside the ring, but also before that. So this has been very, very eye-opening.
Well, again, I was fortunate enough that we had enough in common, and we both had a little bit of wild streak, and we both could be trusted with each other. Like, he knew I would never, ever lie. I always had his back, and I knew he had my back. If I was losing a fight, he never had to jump in, but I knew he would.
If he needed, yeah.
He would let me take a few shots before he got in. But, and that's the thing. We went back as kids, and that was a bond, and we had that bond our whole life, our whole life.
And
I still miss him.
I can tell it. Just I can hear it in your voice, and I completely understand. It's a friendship like that is just something that just transcends everything, and I'm just so grateful that you two just were able to find each other in this. Life is hard enough, right? And for you two to find each other, a real quality friend in each other, that's incredible. That's like that in itself is what a great story is.
Yeah, and Rod gave me, he got halfway through the book and then he died. So the writer had his son and daughter add to it.
Yes.
And so they gave me a copy of the book, and it's actually just about 3 feet away from me. And, it was a lot of nice things that was said about me by Rod. And, like one of the things in his book, he said that something like, when they came to Edmonton, he said, Rod just lit Reed up like he's never lit up with any of his other friends that we talked to. And again, it was that trust, knowing I got his back his whole life, but I only liked him, just because of who he was, and not who, like the Roddy Piper, but the Rod Toombs.
Yes.
Those are the buddies, of that way back when. So. Well,
listen, I really, really appreciate, getting to know a little bit more about him through you. And, this has been absolutely tremendous.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it.
Before we head into the next segment of tonight's program, my conversation with wrestler and wrestling historian Vance Nevada, I'm going to play some more classic Roddy Piper promo material. Now, earlier in this episode, you've heard Fired Up Roddy, you've heard Crazy Roddy, you've heard the stories about how crazy Roddy really could be, but there is another side to Roddy Piper. And I think that this promo that I'm going to play for you guys right now, although it is a long one, I will forewarn everybody, but it may be one of the greatest instances of real-life Roddy fleshing himself out in a wrestling ring. So I'm going to play this classic Roddy Piper material. This comes from the WWE in a program with fellow Winnipeg alumni Chris Jericho. So please enjoy this, a little bit of Roddy Piper audio. Once again, it's a little bit long, but I think it's really going to set the tone, especially considering the conversation that Vance and myself have coming up regarding, kind of the evolution of Roddy Piper, and especially how later on in life he really let himself be himself, if that makes sense. I think when you hear my conversation with Vance, that statement is going to ring a lot more true. So, once again, please enjoy this classic Roddy Piper audio. Once again, it is a little bit long. However, I think it's the perfect way to illustrate kind of what we're leading into with my conversation with Vance. And on the other side of that audio, my interview with wrestling historian Vance Nevada.
The Academy Awards are this Sunday, and if any of the members of the Academy are watching, I implore you to not vote for Mickey Rourke for Best Actor. Because if you do, it could spark a chain reaction that has terrible consequences on this business. You see, if Rourke wins, that could send a message to all of the Hall of Famers, all of the legends, all of the washed up, has-been losers who are holding on, leeching off this business, begging for one last run at success. But I'm here to say that's not going to happen. They're very delusional about this, but the truth is, it won't happen, and the only one with enough courage to tell them so is me. But I know why all of you respect the legends so, why you cheer for them, why you encourage them, why you enable them. It's because they're all just like you. Weak, shallow, insecure human beings, hypocrites and liars who need to be shut down and shut up for their own good. And you can boo me if you want, but you're booing an honest man. A man who tells the truth. Yeah, you don't like that, do you? But the truth hurts. And I will continue to tell the truth.
Hey! It is!
Talk about legends.
It is really Roddy Piper!
WWE Hall of Famer. Hot Rod! A standing ovation for Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper here on Raw to confront Jericho. This is great. Look at the look on Jericho's face. You know what? I hope that somewhere Mickey Rourke is watching this.
You want the truth? I'm gonna shoot with you on this one. Let me tell you something, man. You know, I have watched you your entire career, and I liked you. I tell you why. You said what was on your mind, and then you had the guts to come in the ring and back it up. I respected that. Reminded me of somebody I know. What happened? Now you get on television and you're running your mouth. You're calling me out. You're calling Flair out. You're calling the other legends out. You used to be entertaining. What happened? You're judging us. You patronize us. You tell us what we should be and should not be doing. Let me take one of your quotes. Please shut the hell up.
Sure, Piper. Dance like a puppet on the string. Make all of these fans cheer for you.
I'm not finished yet! Mickey Rourke is my friend. And I watched his movie, The Wrestler. And yes, I cried. The movie is not about a bunch of old-timers that want another run. The movie is about the honor and respect we have for everyone. The movie is about the pain, physically and emotionally. And most of all, most important, why we do what we do? For the thrill of performing. Ric Flair was right. We live for this. I have people that come up to me and they say to me, "Hey, Roddy, we remember when you slapped Mr. T." And I have people come up to me and say, "When my granddad was alive, we watched you
We watched you shave Adrian Adonis's head. And Chris, you want to bury these moments. No. These moments are to be celebrated. These moments. Last year, I was in the Royal Rumble, and when I came out in Madison Square Garden, 24,000 people jumped to their feet, and just for 1 second, Chris, I felt like I was back in the first WrestleMania. That was the thrill of a lifetime for me. I have one hip and I hurt all the time. But as long as these folks here say so, I will crawl down here on my hands and knees to give them one more memorable moment, because old school's cool.
All right, very pleased to be joined on the line this evening by wrestling historian and possibly the most wrestling savant in terms of Western Canadian wrestling that I possibly have ever ran into in this crazy world of podcasting, Mr. Vance Nevada. Vance, how you doing?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you on the program, and I actually was talking to many people who know of you and know you as well, and it's your name that kept coming up throughout the first year of the program. It just one of those things where piece never quite fit, but I'm very happy to be having you on season 2 here to talk some Rowdy Roddy Piper.
Yeah, that sounds great. It's a topic that I love to discuss.
So for anybody who's sitting at home and is not familiar with yourself, can you just give a little bit of backstory about yourself and then yourself in terms of professional wrestling?
Sure. Well, you know what? I got my start as a prairie kid from Souris, Manitoba. Started wrestling in Winnipeg in 1993, and then in 2001, my first opportunity to tour nationally came up. And since that time, I've over the course of my career, I've wrestled more than 1,500 matches from coast to coast in Canada and a little bit in the United States. Have written 2 books on the history of professional wrestling, and have done almost every job there is to do in wrestling, from wrestling to managing to promoting to writing television, and even training guys as well.
And in terms of the books, because I want to get a little bit more in depth into that, because these are essentially historical Bibles that you've written.
The first one, that would be a very generous estimation of the book. So, what happened for me is, when you get into wrestling as a teenager and you're a big fan, you think you know everything about wrestling. And, and like a teenager, you think you know everything about everything, really. And when I got into I'd been wrestling about a year, and the gentleman that had initially given me my start was an old Frenchman from Somerset, Manitoba, named Ernest Rowe. And Ernest was a pipeline worker by trade. He was kind of like a part-time promoter, but his credentials as a wrestler and trainer were, I would say, highly inflated, and because he was so well liked, people just allowed him to do that. But they had made a reference, because I had never been able to find any records. I'd seen a few matches, on the independents with Ernest Rowe wrestling, but other than a handful of matches, I couldn't find anything. And about a year in, a guy doing television commentary on one of my matches said, Vance Nevada was trained by Ernie Rowe, who was a partner with Frenchie Champagne in the old Madison Club in Winnipeg. And I'd never heard of the Madison Club. I'd never heard of Frenchie Champagne. And being 18 years old, I thought, well, he must not be a big deal because I know everything about wrestling and I've never heard of him. But it piqued my curiosity, and that's, it sort of began. So the summer of 1994, every time I'd go into Winnipeg for the wrestling matches, I'd go in early and spend my days in the Winnipeg archives, going through old microfilm. And it was just sort of like the tip of the iceberg. So that summer I found out that Frenchie Champagne, from the 1950s to the 1970s in Manitoba was a huge deal.
Yes.
He was like a headliner on the local shows, but he also refereed when the big shows would come in from Minneapolis. He did a little bit of promoting, and some of the first shows that he promoted included a young Roddy Piper. And that just sort of got the ball rolling. And then I thought, well, I should do a book about Winnipeg wrestling. And then I would get so far along, and I'd be waiting on some information. I thought, well, maybe I should expand into Saskatchewan because certainly not a lot happened there. And next thing you know, now today I'm still collecting on those results and making sure that everything is documented. From 1876 to now, I've recorded more than 5,800 pages of results.
Jesus.
Which amounts to more than 55,000 shows.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, the first book was just kind of like an effort to get something out. Really was focused, primarily on Manitoba, the Prairie Provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. The second book expanded to include British Columbia, and it was another 10 years for that book to come out, and it was much more in depth. A lot more road stories from wrestlers themselves. And now this one has been, I never thought that I would do another book. And then the pandemic hit, and there was nothing going on. So I can't really go out and do anything in public. Can't wrestle. The orders are to stay at home and to sit around by yourself. So I dove into working on a national history for professional wrestling in Canada. Which, very similar to the beginning. It's like, based on what I've got started, it shouldn't be that big of a deal.
Yeah.
But, it's been a monster, to put together. I mean, if you consider that, in Ontario alone, from 1990 to the present, they've had more than 72 promotions.
Yeah.
Operate.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So then we multiplied that by 10 provinces. Over the last 10 years. And, but anyway, I'm very happy with how it's taking shape. And I think that, in terms of wrestling fans and wrestling insiders, it's going to be sort of the ultimate argument settler on anything Canadian wrestling. That delves not only into the stories, but also, the complete title histories for more than 600 championships, in Canada, stats, including, the top 50 houses of all time in Canada, the top drawing wrestlers, the most prolific wrestlers, men, women, and tag teams, and other, interesting facts, the first ever battle royal, the first ever cage match, the first ever intergender match, those types of things. So a lot of information in there, and every time I think that I'm done, I think, oh, geez, I should have this other thing. But we're getting very, very close to print on that one, and I'll be glad to see it released to the public.
I have a feeling that people are going to be very surprised to hear some of the attendance figures, especially, because that's kind of the overwhelming, thought about wrestling in Canada. There's not many people there, and the buildings aren't that big, but I think people are going to be very surprised.
Yeah, you know what? The wrestling has eclipsed, houses of 10,000 people more than 400 times.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And some of those top houses, are very competitive with some of the big cities in the United States. So I'm very excited to be able to share that aspect of the business in Canada, and I'm looking forward to being able to make that announcement that it's officially available to order.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to that, and I can't wait to get my hands on that. I'm just salivating. Hey, just hearing all the stats that I can read. That's what I'm here for it. Let's do it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think I'm really excited about is, a lot of times when you will read a wrestling book, and this isn't a dig on anybody that's written one, because there's certainly a lot of work that goes into it, but you'll have the certain marquee stars, like the Hart family and the Rougeau family, and Whipper Billy Watson. They get a lot of press, and then you'll have guys like Eric Froelich and Moose Morawski and Dave Rule that were real workhorses in their day and never seemed to get as much press. And there's a few guys in particular, that are going to be spotlighted in this new book that I've never seen any press on, who had impressive, 30-year careers. That I just excited to share a little bit of news on these guys that deserve some credit and have not got it yet.
And that was always my idea. Naturally, a podcast is a little bit less, a little bit, that's kind of a understatement, labor-intensive than, compiling all of this information and trying to sort through what would make it, what wouldn't, and whatever. But the crux of the program is always to, shed some spotlight on some people who may otherwise, be lost to the sands of time. Or in the case of Piper, someone who, yes, many people know, the quote-unquote Piper story, but many people don't understand the Piper story.
Agreed.
And that's where, like people like yourself, others that I've had that have been joining me on this program, really are shedding some light onto who was Roddy Piper. Yes, we've seen the WWE biography. It was what it was. It was okay, but so much of what is out there is the the pasteurized, the homogenized, you're getting the bare bones, or you're not getting the actual meat of the matter. And
absolutely.
And really, that's what I can't wait to dig into with yourself for this evening. So, in terms of yourself, what would have been your first introduction to Roddy Piper then?
When I was a kid, 10 years old, 9 years old or something like that, when the first WrestleMania happened. So that all that hype that went into the first WrestleMania with MTV and Cyndi Lauper and
Yes.
Roddy Piper, was like all wrapped up in that. And so that was my first introduction to Piper. And I think I was kind of aware of him, and he was a villain. And, being a kid, you don't really key in on the villains as much. But a couple of years later, when I learned that, wait a minute, this guy that's being built from Glasgow, Scotland, is actually from Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Yeah.
Okay, now you've got my full attention. Because here's a guy that when you see him headlining the first WrestleMania, wow, that's incredible that a kid from Winnipeg, Manitoba headlined WrestleMania. And then you realize that, when he started as a 160-pound kid, which at 17 years old, I'm 160 pounds, wrestling in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Like, maybe the Roddy Piper story could be my story.
Yes.
There's something very relatable about that to me. And, just, over the years, particularly learning, what makes a good wrestling heel, the ability to talk people into seats, all of those things combined to make Piper one of those guys that he was just like on my, all-time fave list.
So as you kind of got introduced to him and kind of watched his career progress, for yourself, how much did that influence kind of your direction in wrestling?
I think, when I began, it was just sort of that first glimmer of hope, because, in the business in 1993 is much different than it is today. And even then, it was much different than it was 2 decades prior to that. But, in 1993, guys under 200 pounds weren't common in professional wrestling. It was kind of, this like unwritten rule that if you're under 235 pounds, you're too small to be a wrestler.
Yes.
And so I came in the door at 160 pounds, and I was cannon fodder for the first 6 months of my career. I was getting pummeled, and it wasn't because they hated me. It was just the way the industry was.
Yeah.
It was designed to try to discourage guys that they didn't think were going to make it. and so they did their best to run me off, and I just kept coming back. And so after about a year, they said, "Well, geez, he's not going away. We better teach him something." And that's really when my wrestling education kind of began. I mean, they kind of taught me enough that I could get through a match without breaking my neck. But then it wasn't really until 6 months to a year in where they're like, "Well, now we better actually invest in this guy now."
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, for myself, same thing, right? You don't realize he's from Winnipeg until you hear rumblings, because back in the even the early 90s, still kayfabe was king, so you don't get it, and then you start hearing it, and then okay, he's from here, like this guy's from here, right? So for us growing up, kids of the mid 80s, early 90s, to see somebody from here make it to the big times was super impressive.
But it's, I think, Roddy Piper is a guy that is, even when I had the opportunity to work with him later in his career, is a guy that has very carefully and craftily created his own myth.
Yes.
And he's told that story over and over and over to the point where I believe that he thinks that it is true. I think the number one myth out there is the story of his debut match. And so this is a story that he has told repeatedly about his first ever match being at the Winnipeg Arena against Larry the Axe Henning and losing in about 8 seconds. That match did happen, but that match happened about 2 years after his career had started.
Yes.
His first match was at a community center in Winnipeg against Tony Condello in June 1972. And so you think, well, you know what, maybe he chalked it up as, well, I don't count those early matches for Tony Condello because they were sort of like on the independents, and it wasn't independent at that time. Condello was outlaw.
Yes.
If you weren't with, the major, NWA or AWA organizations, you were an outlaw promoter, and Condello opened as an outlaw promoter in direct defiance of the AWA. And so maybe, you think, well, maybe he didn't want to count that. He wanted to count his first pro match. But his match with Larry Henning wasn't even his first AWA match. Surprisingly for most people, Piper's first AWA match was at Winnipeg Arena against Ric Flair.
Jeez.
So I think that's kind of myth number one. Myth number two in his first book that he published, he credits Al Tomko with being the guy that broke him into professional wrestling. And it wasn't Al Tomko, it was Tony Condello.
Okay, so and this is something I really am fascinated with, and I really want to, and just so everybody listening at home is, we're not trying to shoot holes through a story for fun or anything like that. Yeah, we're just clearing up portions of the story that are, like you said, myths that he has told that have gone repeated throughout years and then get amplified, obviously, with retellings, if you will, by others. But the Condello one I'm fascinated with, and I really want to dig deep on this one with you.
Yeah, so to sort of understand how big of a deal that piece is. In 1971, Tony Condello, was a wrestler. He had been wrestling around Winnipeg for about 10 or 11 years, and he had also done some preliminary work for the AWA. So he'd go down to Minneapolis and wrestle on TV, and lose matches to the Vachon brothers or whoever were the big stars of Minneapolis. And aside from that, Condello, by trade, was a hairdresser.
That's correct, yes.
So Tony Condello is a businessman. He's running his salons in Winnipeg. He sees an opportunity, and he sort of hears through the grapevine that Vern Gagne in Minneapolis is unhappy with Al Tomko in Winnipeg. So he makes his intentions known through Wally Carbo that he wants to take over as the Winnipeg agent for the AWA. So while Wally Carbo says, that's great. We'll set up a meeting with Vern, come down to TV in Minneapolis on whatever day, and we'll discuss it. Now, while Tony Condello was on the phone with Wally Carbo, one of the local wrestlers around Winnipeg at that time, a man named Dave Muir, overheard the conversation and stooged off to Al Tomko that Condello was making a play for his spot.
He's making plays, yeah.
So Al Tomko, in retaliation, called Vern Gagne and said, listen, you don't want to do business with this guy. He's connected with the Montreal Mafia. And then on top of that, called ahead to the border and let them know, hey, this guy's coming across to work without a work visa. So Condello shows up at the border to go for his meeting with Vern Gagne. He gets turned back at the border. At that time, he just thinks, oh, whatever, I'll just go to a different border crossing, not realizing that these people talk to each other.
Yeah, that and he's been stooged.
Now he's been turned back twice, goes back home, and he is bitter. Talks to Wally Carbo on the phone. Wally, in the meantime, identifies, hey, man, the damage has been done. You've been identified as connections to the Mafia. Vern Gagne wants nothing to do with you. So not only did he lose out on becoming the Winnipeg agent for the AWA, he also lost out on any bookings for the AWA, even when they came to Canada.
Yes.
So Condello, being bitter, he's been shut out, decides, well, you know what, I'm going to open a wrestling school, and I'm going to run opposition. The wrestling school, really, up until that point, there really wasn't such a thing as an organized wrestling school. You almost, had to get vouched in, like Mafia.
Yeah.
You had to know somebody. And so it was almost like a on-the-job apprenticeship to get into wrestling. But Condello decided to open a school. So he did some newspaper advertisements. Actually, initially he had Whipper Billy Watson's son, Phil, advertised as involved as one of the trainers. And in that first class, one of the guys was Roddy Piper. Piper wrestled with Condello for about a year and a half. And then he had an opportunity to go work for the AWA. Now, this is how significant this is. In the 50s and 60s, Winnipeg had a thriving local wrestling scene. You had a lot of clubs operating. The Madison Club out of St. Boniface, the Crescent Club running downtown. There was a couple up in like the Brooklands, northwest area of the city. There's about 4 or 5 different clubs that were running in Winnipeg. When the AWA first came into Winnipeg in 1966, they were doing okay, but they might be only drawing 1,000 people or 1,200 people at the Winnipeg Civic Auditorium. Meanwhile, the local club show that had been established in St. Boniface was drawing 800 a week.
Yeah.
So Vern Gagne saw it as opposition, so he told Al Tomko, listen, offer these local guys spots on the auditorium shows. It's going to cost you $40, and we're going to get them licensed, and this is going to kill our competition. Because what happened is the local club shows were being run as semi-professional, meaning that they were able to skate past commission regulations. The promoters didn't have to be licensed, and the wrestlers didn't have to be licensed. They were considered amateur. But as soon as they did one match for the AWA and got a license as a professional wrestler, they couldn't wrestle on those amateur shows anymore. So effectively, by taking the top guys like Bobby Jones and Bruce Morawski, even Tony Condello, and allowing them to wrestle at the Winnipeg Civic Auditorium, now they were done. They couldn't go back to doing local shows.
And now they can't go anywhere else either because at that point the AWA is the only game in town here.
They're shut out. So the idea, and in Piper's second book that he started to write and then he passed away and his kids finished the book, they make the assertion that Condello and Al Tomko, were amicable and they were sharing talent, and Piper was training at both. It's just not possible because of the heat between Condello and Tomko at the time. And even if you talk to Tony Condello to this day, 50 years after the fact, he still can't say a kind word about Al Tomko. So that's kind of a big deal. But where Al Tomko was influential in Piper's early career is Tomko booked Piper for the AWA, took him down to Minneapolis for his first exposure to the AWA in the United States. It also helped to get him across the border when he went to Kansas City, which was a starting point, because then he went from Kansas City to Texas, to California, to Portland, and those were all launching points before he went to the Carolinas and Georgia and became a big star.
So before we kind of jump into that portion of the conversation, there's just one aspect about the Tony Condello story that I want to circle back to, because again, this is something that has either gone unreported or is misreported or is, mythified, or however you want to pronounce it. But
sure. So
in addition to obviously his wrestling background and what he was doing in terms of a business acumen, Tony Condello was a boxer as well, right? An amateur boxer?
No.
He wasn't?
No. Tony as a kid, he had immigrated to Canada during World War II, when a lot of Italians were escaping Europe because of all of the activity that was happening there with the Nazis in Italy. So he came to Canada not speaking a word of English, in the 1940s as a kid, and got into a lot of fights because at that time, people have heard the term WAP, sort of a derogatory term about Italians. Well, WAP stands for without papers. And what that meant at that time was, if you came to Canada as an Italian and people wanted to sort of get your dander up, they would call you a WAP, saying that you're without papers, meaning you're a man without a country. You don't belong here and you don't belong there. And so that would fire up, Condello, and he would get in lots of fights in school. But he was a small guy, still is a small guy. And so as a result, you'd get in these fights and get his butt kicked a lot. So he went down to the Winnipeg YMCA, and there was an amateur wrestler down there, a guy by the name of Alfred Wurr, who was an amateur wrestling champion, and he trained with Alf as an amateur wrestler, and did a few tournaments. And that's when a gentleman named Joe Fiorino, another Italian wrestler from Winnipeg, who was working on those club shows in Winnipeg in the 60s, said, "Hey, Tony, why don't you give pro wrestling a try?" And Tony's like, "Pro wrestling? Why do I want to do that phony shit?" But that was his introduction, and he started wrestling as a middleweight wrestler, on the club shows in Winnipeg, and moved on from there.
The reason I brought up Tony and boxing is also the story of Roddy Piper and a boxing Golden Gloves. Maybe he had won those, maybe he hadn't won those. And this is something as well that is kind of talked about, but not really expanded upon, or maybe glossed over, or maybe exemplified, if you will, for lack of a better term. But what were you able to find out, and what's the story behind the story of Roddy Piper being a Golden Gloves boxer?
Piper's Golden Gloves boxing career, from anything that I've been able to find, is fictional. I think that later on, particularly, as he started to expand more in Canada, but I would say even more so when he got to Los Angeles, and working with guys like Gene LaBelle, and training there as he started to sort of put on mass. Probably you saw more of his boxing skills there. What I suspect happened is, Piper was a small guy, and a small guy in professional wrestling was pretty uncommon.
Back then, for sure.
Particularly, when you were striving to be a big name. However, if you think even today, some of the biggest money boxers like Floyd Money Mayweather or Sugar Ray Leonard, these are big money guys, but they're small guys. And so for Piper to get into professional wrestling without an amateur background, the easiest story to tell and have stick and have people believe would be, well, I'm a Golden Gloves boxer. Because he had the size and stature of someone that could potentially be a boxer. And the other thing is, in the pre-internet age, lots of people have made claims about credentials they had in Canada, and within the industry, we laugh a lot because we run into people at different times, and when they hear you're a wrestler, they'll say, "Oh yeah, I also wrestled. I wrestled for Stu Hart in Stampede," because that circuit ran for so long, and there was no formal record book anywhere. It's easy for people to skate on that lie and not get caught.
Yeah.
There was a guy. He's originally from Vancouver. Maybe he might have even been originally from Calgary, but he was living in Vancouver in the 70s. Now he lives in Washington. His self-proclaimed name is the Supertramp, and he's sort of had this career in northwestern United States for a few years, based on this false reputation that he worked for Stampede in the 70s. Until I came along and debunked that whole myth with dates and details. So yeah, the Golden Gloves thing, I've found no evidence of that. And I think the second book, Rowdy, that his kids co-authored, I think they get more. It's still not all the way there, but it's much closer to the truth and sort of the realities of Piper's teenage years growing up in Saskatoon and then later Winnipeg.
Yeah, and I always wondered about that as well, because, obviously he had passed away during the course of it, and then I don't remember who the writer was for it, because he had somebody like ghostwrite, or whatever the proper term is.
Yeah.
So it always struck me as, okay, how much of this is now closer to reality then? And I'm not saying that, I don't mean to say that in a derogatory way either.
No, absolutely.
But for those of us who, because I'll be honest, the true story of Piper is, I find more fascinating than the glamorized one. When I'm hearing about, he's a bouncer at a bar in Windsor Park, and instead of, you would think automatically that he's probably there brawling or whatever, but that he's there and just, he would talk guys out of fights, essentially. You hear these stories about how, he really was, from a young age, in his teens and whatever, using his verbal skills that would, so greatly help him later in life, that these were developed at such a young age, and that it just progresses. Like, these are the stories that I find more fascinating than, the falderall, to be quite honest, that you find with a lot of the other programs.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely, if Piper had come into fame at this point in society, the way that he would feel comfortable in portraying his story, I think, plays out a lot differently. In 2011, I had a chance to work with Piper pretty closely for several weeks, doing a reality TV show called World of Hurt. And so you're on set for 12 hours a day for a couple of weeks. And there was stuff that he would, sort of have these moments of honesty and clarity on camera. But then there was also, the real Roddy Piper when the cameras were off, where he would just share a little glimpse. So one of the things I can remember him saying to, one of the younger wrestlers on the show was, the locker room is no place for emotion. Because when someone gets emotional, that's when anxiety starts to rise. But that's also where, those ribbers in the locker room and those tormentors find their victims.
Yeah.
They find the people that can be riled. So you never want to show weakness. You never want to tell your tale of woe. You never want to talk about the adversity you've overcome. You just always want to be conscious and protective of that image, up to, being very directive with promoters and bookers about what you will or will not do in the ring, and specifically on camera. And even long after, they're their peak period of their career, a lot of those guys of that territory era held on to that. I can remember working with someone who had been off TV for more than 2 decades and was now in their 60s, and they were wrestling, and they said, you know what, I can't be pinned because that kills my business.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm like, you know what, you're 62 years old, you're wrestling against guys that are 28 and 30 years old at the peak of their careers. Nobody's expecting you to win. I mean, yeah, there's certainly that emotional and nostalgia component to your appeal as a performer and as a draw, but no one's expecting you to win the world championship tonight.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I had a question just in terms of your interactions with Piper on set. When you were working with him at the time, did you get the sense that he was kind of always Roddy Piper? Like that's who he was, instead of allowing himself to be, human, he was always on. Is that something that you got from him in terms of that's just who he was at that point in time?
I think there's a lot more. I think that statement is true, but not in the way that you might believe. We all got very familiar with Roddy Piper in the 80s. Cocaine fueled on that rocket ride that was the national expansion of the WWF as the headline heel at the center of it all.
Yes.
And really, when you think about, WrestleMania, as much as that first initial push in the WWF was built on Hulk Hogan, it doesn't work if you don't have an antagonist that is seen by the people as equal, or at least equally infuriating.
Yes.
And Piper was there in that mix with Cyndi Lauper and Hulk Hogan and Mr. T in 85, 86. He probably was wrestling fewer matches than all of his peers because he was able to say, listen, I'm not wrestling on TV, I'm just going to do the Piper's Pit on TV. If people are going to see Roddy Piper wrestle, they got to pay to buy a ticket.
Yes.
So he's always very, very, carefully guarded. What I noticed about Roddy Piper, and in some ways I didn't see it until it was happening. We're working with a production company out of Calgary called Pyramid Productions, and they didn't want to tell us anything because they wanted all our reactions to be natural. And I sort of understand what you're saying, but what you need to realize with professional wrestlers is nothing is on the fly or improv, because that's how people get hurt. So when you tell me, I want your natural reaction, it's a little bit from that same school that Roddy Piper was talking about, saying we don't show emotion outside of bell to bell without being instructed by the production company on where we're going. So I'm forever grateful for that.
And do you think that in terms of that, that's obviously a way that he would have had to grow into acting like that, right? Considering where he came from in the wrestling environment, there's no way that he would have wound up that way, I guess is the best way to put it, if he didn't work on his character to get himself to that point, right? It would be very easy for him to just live off his laurels as a big star in the 80s, for example, and then just treat people like, I think you can understand the way that I'm going with it, rather than step out of his shell and really try and be, a bigger person in terms of helping others.
Yeah, and I think though, with Roddy Piper, he is very genuine, and the one thing that he understood about wrestling is, and this is one of those things that really gets lost in today's generation of wrestlers, is when you ask somebody, why do you want to do this? And they're going to give you lots of answers and say, well, I just really want to get out there and do something for the fans, or make my impact as a performer. And Piper would be like, wrong answer. Like, wrestling is a business, and we do this to make money, and it's a great way to make money if you can do it right. And so that's his approach. But I mean, you have to also consider that Piper came in to the business in an era where old people really, not old people, but established wrestlers really fought hard to maintain their spot.
Yes.
And so, particularly in the territories, right? If you had a guy who was, in the Los Angeles territory, his family roots were there, his kids were in school, he didn't want to have to move to another territory. He's going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that he's always going to have a job in the Los Angeles territory. And then you have a young heel come up like Piper, who just blew up the scene. Now you have guys that are jealous. They're going to do things to rib you or compromise your spot. Piper's first tryout with the WWF went exactly that way. He got called up from Los Angeles based on the report that this guy was getting great heat, so much heat in Los Angeles that they could book Roddy Piper at 6'1" and 220 pounds against Andre the Giant and have people believe it.
Yes.
That's how much heat he had in Los Angeles. So on the heels of that, Vince McMahon says, well, we need to see this guy in New York. So they fly Roddy Piper in from LA to work Madison Square Garden. And, before the show, everybody's being really nice to him. Like, hey, kid, great to see you. Maybe there's a few guys hanging around that Piper recognized from his early days in the AWA. But what happened was Captain Lou Albano, Freddie Blassie, and the Grand Wizard, the managers, decided they're going to rib this young guy. So he goes out for his grand debut, shot his bagpipes, and is trying to play his way to the ring in Madison Square Garden, and no sound is coming out. And what they had done is they had shoved tissue paper.
Yeah, that's right.
Into the bagpipes to deliberately sandbag him. That could have been a career-ending rib right there, where, okay, well, here's this kid, but he fucking blew his own gimmick.
Yeah.
He couldn't deliver on this thing that makes him different from everyone else. We're not going to have him back. And so when you deal with that, where people will mess with you, one of the cool things about Piper, and the reason he was so good with promos, he said, here's my strategy. He goes, early on in my career, I'd be driving, long drives from town to town, making my bookings. I'd hear something on the radio. Maybe it's a radio jingle, maybe it's a news story. It could be anything. It could be lyrics out of a song, and it gives you an idea. And so I would take this yellow lined legal notepad, and I would have it on the passenger seat of the car. And as I would have that idea, I'd be scribbling on that notepad as I'm shuttling down the freeways from town to town. And and that was one of the pieces of advice he gave us is, if you want to get over, you need to be able to get over in your promos. And if you're going to get over in your promos, you need to know what you're going to say, and you need to say it creatively. So always have that notepad. Always be jotting down ideas. And if anybody tries to look at your notepad, or you see somebody messing around in your bag, mess them up. Because they're trying to take your money. And so that's the era that he grew up in. So it's very easy for him to be suspicious of other people and not want to sort of extend a hand to help the next generation up. But I didn't find that at all. In fact, I found the opposite, where he was giving us the best advice possible, and it was very individualized to the guys that were part of that production. The advice that he gave to me was, listen, you are at this stage in your life, 35 years old. You've got a young family at home. At that time I had a newborn baby at home. You got a steady job outside of wrestling. You got a nice family. You don't want to go and do this life. At best, go the George the Animal Steel route, where you're in the case of George the Animal Steel. George the Animal Steel was a school teacher.
Yeah, that's
in
right.
Detroit. says you go and you do your thing, and then when summer vacation comes, you say, hey, Mama, I'm going to make the retirement money, and then you go wrestle for the summer, and then you come back and settle into, what your pensionable earnings.
Yeah.
And that was, really good advice for me, especially at that stage in life. Because, if you haven't been signed, by the time you're 35, you're probably not getting signed. So you don't need to be on the road every weekend hoping to get discovered, because it's not happening. Work it around your life. It was, a good reality check, to have. Not that I was having any, delusions of well, I think I still have the talent to make it. I knew that opportunity had already passed me by.
But I find that piece of advice, if the financial future aspect of it, fascinating, because often you'll hear, and it's not just the old timers, I don't want to say it that way, but you'll hear it's a lot of the bragging, it's the spend money now, make more later kind of way to look at things, right? Whereas you look at someone like Piper, who's been there, who's done it, and he's saying no, make sure you're set up for the long run.
Yeah, and I mean, sadly, you could do a whole podcast just on guys that were at the top, top money in the business, that ended up penniless.
Oh my God! Well, and that was last month we just did Gordienko, and that's just look at what happened with him, right?
Yeah, but I think Johnny Valiant, he had an interesting career. So he broke in, in the New York territory. He did a little bit of stuff, touring around some of the other circuits, but pretty much was based in New York for most of his career. A great talker, good heel. And he had made a statement sort of after his WWF career was done that, I always thought there would be a spot in the wrestling industry for someone like me. I never thought that the train would ever end.
Yeah.
And then, after his wrestling career was over, he did a little bit of spot acting on some shows, but he was living in a one-room apartment, and basically broke. And sadly, there's lots of stories like that. So, I think Piper was a guy who always separated business from family. And it wasn't until very, later on in his career where, you're even aware that, well, geez, Piper has kids.
Mm-hmm.
He had 4 kids. To do what we were doing as wrestlers at that time with the schedule that they had, and be a dad and take care of everything at home, huge responsibility. And so I think that, transitioning out of wrestling and getting into acting was a great opportunity for Rod, because it was less time away from home at any given time, more time to be dad, but still take care of the things that need to be taken care of.
I wonder how much of his outlook on all of this would have come directly from his time in the territories before, quote-unquote, making it big. Because if he would have came through the AWA or Portland or Los Angeles or whatever, and seen how these top-tier stars were essentially burning themselves out, literally and figuratively, how much of that would have affected his mindset of I don't want to wind up like these guys. I need to figure out some other way to do this.
Yeah, I think that certainly played into it, and I think especially spending as much time in Los Angeles as he did in the formative years of his career, and seeing the opportunity to transition. Hogan had the cameo in Rocky III and had a few guest spots on television on sitcoms and things like that. That were sort of handed to him, but Piper saw the opportunity to go out and actually make a career of it.
Yes.
And he did. I think his film credits, he's done 65 movies and TV shows.
Yeah, it's quite a bit more than most people realize.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people will talk about They Live. Obviously, that's one of the bigger ones.
Yeah, that was kind of his first breakout role. Then there were some really bad ones, quite honestly. The martial arts movie with Billy Blanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the one with the frog people. The name escapes me at this minute, but...
Yeah, Hell Comes to Frog Town.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, there was also like some moments of his acting career where Roddy Piper himself kind of shone through. And I think his final movie, The Masked Saint, is one of those examples of that, where you really got to see Piper, and even the Cold Case episode he did, where it was a wrestling themed episode, and he was sort of playing the one of the villains later on, years after the incident had happened.
Yes.
There was definitely some kernels of real life that were threaded into that performance.
And I guess he would have so much. I'm not talking about criminality aspect of it, but there's so many stories and so much information that he would have been exposed to throughout his time in the territories. It's almost by osmosis that he's able to just draw upon all of these stories and fables and whatever, and kind of mold them into whatever he needs to use at a later point in time.
Well, definitely there's stories and legends we've heard about Roddy Piper that we hoped would show up in the book, or hope would be mentioned in the DVD, that definitely were not. I'd say don't speak as much to who Piper was at the time, but what the industry was at the time.
Can you speak to any of those, by the way?
Well, I think probably one of the most notorious ones that actually hit the mainstream papers was an incident after a show in Fresno, California, where they had I think partly it was maybe they had a hot crowd and now they're going to go out and they're going to go in the town. And being the Los Angeles territory that Piper was very familiar with, maybe he knew the right haunts to go to, where the party was going to be. So Don Morocco and Bob Orton Jr. and Roddy Piper are out on the town. They get in their rental car. Some incident happens with their rental car, and they just leave it parked on a train track. They make it back to their hotel. By the time they get back to their hotel, somehow Bob Orton Jr. gets locked out of his hotel room, and he's running around the hotel lobby naked. The police get called, and then there's a brawl with this large naked man. If that type of incident, I mean, that was in 1987, 86. If that type of incident were to happen now in wrestling,
oh my God,
those guys wouldn't even report to TV the next day. Those guys would be fired.
Yeah.
There's kind of and this is one that's never made press, but it's kind of a story that Piper has told to people, in the industry, that he's mentored, talking about sort of the peak of that time in the WWF in the mid-'80s. And they're at Madison Square Garden, and it's almost time for Piper to go on. And he's in a bathroom stall, self-medicating. And specifically, snorting lines off of a toilet paper dispenser. And all of a sudden he looks up, and he sees a pair of hands up the top of one side of the stall, and a pair of hands at the other side, the top of the stall. And Vince McMahon looks over one side, and Pat Patterson looks over the other side. They see what's going on. And Piper looks up from what he's doing, and he says, "You see that house out there? We're drawing. That means I'm doing my job. Now fuck off."
Jesus.
And with that, the hands come down and the heads come down, and they left him alone. He was the company's top heel, and he was doing the job he needed to do in whatever manner he needed to do it. So now things like the wellness policy exist. So probably that behavior, wouldn't take place now, but at that period in time, Jim Brunzell tells a story about, sort of being at, the height of that success, and Vince McMahon himself, doing an 8-ball of cocaine in front of the wrestlers, feeling that they were invincible, so there was a lot of craziness that were happening in wrestling at that time.
Well, I even remember stories from Brett's book where they're at bars and just, it's liquor and drugs and they're smashing the place up, and it was then it's on to the next town, and that's what it was.
And it wasn't. I mean, people can say, "Oh, that's shameful," but that wasn't just the case for professional wrestling.
No, and that's
professional baseball, professional football.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is an important aspect to what we're talking about. It's not only the wrestlers were a bunch of maniacs and Zabadog had out of hand. That's what was happening at that point in time, in sports in general.
Yeah, I mean,
look at hockey too. Hockey was no different.
Yeah, there's been a lot of fuss created about the plane ride from hell in recent months. People have lost their jobs over it. People have lost endorsements over it. There was a Major League Baseball team, and I don't follow baseball, so I don't know who it was. I think it was around 1984, where they had this drunken debauchery on a plane and completely destroyed an airplane. That story hasn't resurfaced. Now in the modern age, where there's no statute of limitations on public opinion. But these types of stories are rampant in professional sports. So it certainly wasn't exclusive to professional wrestling or to the WWF or to Roddy Piper.
But I think that also feeds more into the overall story. Is that, yeah, he did the craziness. Yeah, there was, drug fueled whatever, as with everybody at that point, but you get the other side of it, where he comes out on the other side, and then it's the acting, and then it's everything else that he ends up doing. And I mean, obviously his life was cut way, way, way too short, but regardless of that, it's not like he was just a pill popping cokehead for 30 years. It's just not. No, that's not what happened.
No, and I think that there's another piece to it. And every now and then you get a glimpse at it, and then something will get recanted, and then it's gone. But Piper, by the time he had hit his major opportunity in 1984 in the WWF, was dealing with some untreated trauma that occurred in the wrestling business. And specifically, he was raped. And every now and then, he would be doing an interview. I'm trying to remember specifically. There was one particular interview that Piper had done where he was really, his hair was grown out. He had a ball cap on. He was kind of slouched in a chair, very disheveled. And he makes reference to it about, something happening to him. And there was a story circulating for a while that it was Pat Patterson that had done something to him while they were in California. And Piper came out swinging, saying, "No, that absolutely did not happen. It wasn't. Pat Patterson has never done anything to me. But something did happen, and I can speak to that because when we were doing World of Hurt, one of the first days that we were on set, he had the whole crew there, and he's kind of going through his wisdom and advice for wrestling, and out of nowhere, just kind of in passing, he's like, this is a hard business. There are many dues you're going to pay. There's many sacrifices you're going to make, and I've paid them. And he said, I was raped. And then, as quickly as he said it, he was on to the next topic. None of that dialogue made the final cut of the show. And certainly for that period of time, there'd be a lot of shame associated with that.
Yes.
Nowadays, probably you would be still maybe embarrassed and ashamed, but it's not career-ending. And there's less stigma around outing the offenders as there was at that time. And so when you sort of put all that together, dealing with this untreated trauma, dealing with the pressure of being a main event heel for a national company as a guy that's only 6'1" and 235 pounds, pitted against a guy that's 6'7" and 300 pounds. The pressures to make sure that you're taken care of creatively and not used as a disposable heel to build that monster baby face that Vince was building his company around, to be able to provide for that family of four, that you've got four family of six, including himself and his wife.
Yes.
At home in Portland, Oregon. Like, all of these things contribute to the behavior and the decision making and the stresses on the man.
Which, I kind of keep circling back to this point of, like, look at how all of these things kind of shape him who he winds up being, but what's more impressive is how he was able to pull out of a lot of this, right? Not just from, a pretty rough childhood to, dealing with stardom, to then dealing with other issues and traumas that happened to him and seem to, unfortunately keep happening to him. And then still kind of rise above and get out of it after it all. Because it would be very, very easy to go down a very, very dark and dangerous path. And, wow, it's almost shocking that he didn't. And it's almost horrible to say that, but you look at how many times it's happened in the past, right?
Yeah, he was a very resilient character, and one of the things that I think the lasting impressions that he left with me, we started talking about family, and he had that leather jacket that he wore everywhere, particularly later in his career. And as we're talking about family, he reached into like the inside zipper pocket of his jacket, and inside like a Ziploc sandwich bag, he had a picture of his family and his passport. And those are the two things that he kept closest to his heart. He goes, I always got my family with me wherever I go, and my passport in case I need to get out of somewhere quick. That was what Rod was all about. It was about navigating this very political climate of professional wrestling as a means to feed his family. And trying to make the right moves politically to make sure that he was able to get over and stay over for the duration of his career.
Now, as we start to wrap up, is there any stories or aspects of his early life or life and career that we haven't touched on that you would want to touch on?
I just think that to look at Roddy Piper's career, definitely his promos stand out as those that endure the test of time. You can take a Roddy Piper promo today, and it's just as relevant and just as good as it was in 1985 or even earlier. And I think if you're Googling Roddy Piper promos, you definitely see a lot of his stuff from the WWF pops up. But probably the best promo, if fans haven't seen it, is one that he cut while he was wrestling for Vancouver All-Star Wrestling. This is while in the time he was in Portland, circling back to work with Al Tomko, who had sort of given him his break in the States. Now Al Tomko is the promoter in Vancouver. Piper is teaming with Rick Martel, and they're in a program against the sheep herders, who related to the bushwhackers.
Yeah.
And Piper does this big setup talking about how he's ready to face the bushwhackers and how tough he is, and in doing so, breaks a beer bottle over his head on live TV. And it's not a candy glass one because the blood comes instantly. So if fans haven't seen it, I definitely recommend that they check it out. And if you can find it, the rebuttal from the sheep herders the following week on TV is just as good, and what they do with their beer bottle. But Roddy Piper was a guy that was committed to his craft at all costs, and took it very seriously, and took himself very seriously, and respected the wrestling business. And I think that is definitely, on top of being, a family man that did whatever he needed to do for his kids, is his lasting legacy.
I think that's about as perfect a way as we could end this conversation. Vance, honestly, this has been absolutely tremendous. Where can people get in touch with you to see what's happening with the book and your other projects?
The easiest way to find me at the present time is on Facebook. Look for Vance Nevada. And I'm hoping that within a matter of weeks we'll be looking at a pre-sale announcement and full details on how to get the book in hard copy, or sort of hardcover, soft cover, and e-edition.
Tremendous. And then obviously as I get those details as well, I'll be passing it along to all of the listeners to this program. Vance, thank you again. I can't thank you enough tonight.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I'd gladly come back again.
Before we head to the finish of tonight's program, I'm going to play one more classic Roddy Piper audio clip. This comes from the aforementioned incident in All-Star Wrestling, Roddy Piper and Rick Bartel versus the Sheep Herders. I would highly encourage anybody to seek this one out on YouTube as well, because the video or the visual is just, it's something else. Just Piper with the beer bottle, smashing it. There's blood everywhere and fire in his eyes, and he lays it on the line. So please enjoy this classic Roddy Piper audio. Once again, if you have some time, search for it on YouTube yourself. And on the other side, we're going to close up part 1 of our 2-part series on Roddy Piper.
Where, your forehead?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's not going to be my navel.
Okay. Let's lose silence there.
Okay, quiet.
Silence there.
Watch this now. And that is a genuine beer. I just checked it, didn't I? Whoa! All right. Come here, pal. Come here. I want you to see the glass in my hand, and you listen to me, sheep herders. You listen to me. This would knock just any normal man down, sheep herders. But I want you to just think about one thing. Getting this title in the cage is going to make $45,000 difference in my annual earnings, brother. This is the biggest match of my life, and I'm going to do it with my partner. And you listen to me. There's an old saying, sheep herders. You think we're just getting started? Saddle the ponies. Listen to me, brother. Saddle your pony, you bet. Sheep herders, you're in for a treat. It is showdown time. And showdown time, you bet. And we ain't even saddled our ponies yet.
And animals like you, sheep herders, you put them in a cage, or we put them to sleep forever.
Around the place here, we're going to be taking a break in a minute. I notice there's glass in the ring, so somebody will have to remove that piece. We can't wrestle with it like.
As we finish up tonight's episode, part 1 of our 2-part series on Rowdy Roddy Piper, I first off really want to thank my special guests for joining me on the program this evening. Craig Baird, Cam Cotter, and Vance Nevada. I couldn't have done it without you guys. I really hope that everybody enjoyed the insight and information that each of them brought to the program. And I really hope that everybody understands kind of the progression of the program today. How each guest, without knowing it, fed into the next guest, and how that all kind of comes together to paint a proper picture of Rowdy Roddy Piper. One that I hope will inform quite a few of the listeners. I hope that there was quite a bit of information that you guys didn't know before. And I would also hope that it would spurn some more information seeking of your own. Question a little bit of what you read, but also, go through the YouTube videos, watch Roddy Piper in his interviews, right? Read the information that you could read out there, at least with the basic understanding of what is fact and what is fiction. And I think, in my opinion at least, that the fact is way, way, way more impressive than any fiction that was out there previously. So once again, to my 3 guests, thank you all very much for joining me on part 1 of the Roddy Piper program. Now, before we get out of here, I had mentioned earlier on in the program that we had some 5-star reviews that were left for the podcast, so I want to get into those real quick. This one comes via Mouthdork on Apple Podcasts. He leaves a 5-star review, or they, I should say, leave a 5-star review. They say, "This podcast is an incredibly entertaining and informative endeavor. Every episode is a massive deep dive. If you want short snippets of information, look elsewhere. These episodes are hardcore history lessons. Listen to the latest episode on Gene Kiniski to understand what I'm talking about. The conversations are rich, inviting, and a blast. Stop reading this review and just click subscribe. You won't regret it." Obviously, that one was left a long time ago. I have no idea how I missed it, but thank you very much, Mouthdork, for leaving that tremendous 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We also had another 5-star review left, once again on Apple Podcasts. This one from Caper BC says 5 stars. "Excellent podcast. Andy the Taxman does a fantastic job of presenting each subject from an unbiased perspective. You can tell this is a labor of love for him, and it shows in the quality of each episode. Fantastic, knowledgeable guests complete the package. A must-listen for every wrestling fan and any Canadian history buff." Thank you very much, Caper BC, for that 5-star review. Once again, if you guys leave me a 5-star written review, you can tell I'm verklempt and bum-fuzzled at the end of the program today, as I usually get. But if you leave me a 5-star written review, I am more than happy to read it on the program. So once again, whatever podcast player you are listening to this program on today, please leave a 5-star rating and a written review where applicable. Also wanted to make mention, I wanted to give a shout out to Thomas Bryce from the SportsWire Network. That's where you can hear this program on terrestrial radio, which is pretty interesting. Thomas has quite the collection of... he's got everything from baseball to wrestling to hockey, all kinds of sports, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the SportsWire Network. So you definitely want to check them out on Twitter. They also have a Facebook page as well. You can find that easily navigating through this program's Facebook page, Grappling With Canada. Also wanted to make mention as well, in the show notes for this program, you can find ways to donate to the program to help us out. You can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/grappling. You can use the PayPal link to directly donate to the program. Or you can head on over to grapplingwithcanada.threadless.com. It is the official merchandise store for the podcast. And once again, all sales of the classic Grappling With Canada t-shirt are donated directly to charities. So hop over to grapplingwithcanada.threadless.com and pick up some show merchandise. And when you do, like my boy Thomas did, make sure you let me know so I can give shout outs on social media and kind of put it out there for everybody else to see. Also, I want to make mention, I was very pleased to be a guest spot on the Sunday Night Army podcast once again. Jacob did a tremendous episode regarding music from from people's pasts and some kind of songs that shaped us throughout our lives. So I was very fortunate to be a small part on that program. It was a lot of fun, and I want to thank Jacob and the Sunday Night Army podcast for having me along for that one. I also want to make mention that I have a small guest spot coming up on an episode of Fireside Canada. Now, for anybody who's not familiar with that program, David does a tremendous job of exploring some Canadian folklore. And if you're a fan of Canadian history, I'm sure you are because you're listening to this program, but more so if you know some of the stories of World War I, and you've heard the story passed down through generations of the crucified Canadian. He has an unbelievable episode on that story specifically, which I was blown away by. It's fantastic. So once again, search for Fireside Canada. I'm sure it's on whatever podcast platform that you are listening to this program right now. And look forward in the near future to a little cameo from the Taxman on an upcoming episode. Once again, you can find this program on any podcasting platform of your choosing. Wherever you buy, sell, trade, barter, or steal your favorite podcast, you'll find us. Also want to make mention, youtube.com/c/six-sided podcast is the YouTube page for this show, where you can also see the video for Manscaped, the fine sponsor for this program. Once again, go to manscaped.com, and when you go to checkout with your various wares, and by the way, there are always some tremendous values on bundled packages. So, one, you get this tremendous value on a bundled package. Two, you also get to use the promo code GWC at checkout for 20% off further, and everybody's favorite, free shipping. So once again, Manscaped.com, a fine sponsor of this program. I highly suggest that everybody goes out and checks out some manscaping wares and where-to-dos, if you will. And once again, use the promo code GWC at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. You can also reach me anytime, sixsidepod@gmail.com, and I'm going to do something that I've never done before on one of my programs. Because part 2 of the Roddy Piper program is going to be quite a bit different than this episode was today, for various reasons, I'm going to put this out there in the ether, and we'll see what happens with it. If you have a Roddy Piper memory, if you have a story, if you have something you want to say about Roddy Piper, send me a voice memo to sixsidepod@gmail.com. That's all letters. There's no numbers or gimmicks or anything there. sixsidepod@gmail.com. Send me a voice memo. By the way, you can find that link also in the show notes of this program. Send me a voice memo, and I'll try and get a few of those on the second part of the Roddy Piper episode. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I think it'll be very interesting to see what, the general consensus is about Roddy Piper, what their favorite memories of him are, maybe a favorite match, maybe you met him before. Anything like that, I think it'd be very, very interesting, super neat, and honestly, I think it'd be a lot of fun. So once again, send a voice memo. If you're not sure how to do that, you can also email me, and I'll explain how. And by the way, any emails at sixsidepod@gmail.com, I read everything, and I respond to everything, especially when I go through my spam folder and find a bunch of stuff to go through. But anyways, send me some voice memos, and I will see what I can do about getting them on part 2 of our Roddy Piper series. So, for all of that being said, for myself, the Taxman, for my tremendous guests that I had tonight, and to all of you, I will leave you as I usually do. Take care of yourselves and each other. Good night, everyone.